Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow dive into the less than glorious world of the Middle Ages. The real one. Not the chivalrous, epic music over a dragon battle version. No swords clashing in this one, sorry. Instead, you'll be learning what it smelled like to walk through a medieval city, what people ate for breakfast when eggs were too expensive, and why you definitely wouldn't want to shake hands with anyone. Ever. You're about to find out how often folks actually bathed, what they used for toilet paper, and how absolutely cursed medieval toothpaste really was. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and what time you're listening in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in 13th century England, somewhere humid and a little sour smelling, like wet wool that's been left in a cellar. Your skin itches under your layers of clothing, and honestly, it's not just the fabric, it's you. You haven't bathed in, well, it's been a while. The custom around here is to take a proper bath once a week. That's assuming you can afford the water, the firewood to heat it, and the time to fill the tub. Spoiler, you can't. Baths happen on Saturdays usually. It's sort of a ritual, somewhat religious, somewhat social. Whole families might reuse the same bath water, in order of importance, which is to say, by how much respect you command in the household. First dad, then mum, then the kids, then possibly a pig. The water's cold and grey by the time it's your turn, but at least it's water, right? You duck into the tub trying to keep your knees from knocking against the wooden rim. The soap is a concept, lye-based, homemade, and strong enough to make your hands feel like raw meat. But it does get the job done, mostly by scouring everything off your skin, including a layer of dignity. If you're lucky, someone added herbs to it, maybe lavender or rosemary. That makes the whole thing smell a little less like boiled feet. Now here's a historical fact to carry into your dreams. Public bathhouses were actually a thing in medieval Europe. In cities like Paris and London, there were spots where folks could go in and get clean for a small fee. Bathing wasn't frowned upon, it was just wildly inconvenient and surprisingly expensive. People weren't against being clean, they just didn't have plumbing, and winters were brutal. No one wants to strip down and dunk in cold water when there's frost on the inside of your walls. But here's where it gets weird. Some medieval towns considered bathhouses to be, well, a little shady. Over time, especially after the Black Death started making the rounds, people started associating communal bathing with disease. Because you know what's a great way to spread germs? A big tub that 12 strangers use back to back. So even though bathhouses were popular for a bit, by the 15th century, they were closing up left and right. The church wasn't thrilled about all the naked mingling either. You climb out of the bath, teeth chattering, and wrap yourself in a coarse linen towel that might have been used as a curtain in a previous life. There's no moisturiser, of course. Just a vague hope that your skin will stop flaking once the spring rains come. You dry off, throw on a fresh shift, same as your old one, just marginally less stiff. And you're done. That's your one clean moment for the week. Treasure it. Because starting tomorrow, the grime begins its slow, inevitable return. Now, quirky fact of the night. Some nobles had entire bathing rituals. We're talking perfumed water, floating flower petals, silk robes, even musicians playing softly in the background. One German manuscript describes a bath with 4 people soaking together in a big wooden tub while sipping wine and playing board games. So yeah, rich people have always known how to relax, even if the board games probably involved more Latin than Monopoly. Of course, the debate still rages on in academic circles about just how dirty medieval people really were. Some historians argue that bathing was more common than we think, especially among the upper class. Others point out that sure, people wash their hands and faces regularly, but that's not the same as scrubbing between your toes. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. People wanted to be clean, but the logistics were a nightmare. You slip into bed, really just a straw mattress lumpy and slightly alive with insects, and pull a blanket over yourself. You still smell faintly of smoke, tallow, and human effort, but there's a strange comfort in it. Tomorrow is Sunday, a day of rest, and no one expects much of you, which is good, because your body is stiff, your nails are black from dirt, and the soles of your feet feel like they've been hammered with horseshoes. But tonight you're clean, cleanish. The kind of clean where you don't actively offend anyone within 3 feet. And in the Middle Ages, that's basically spa day. You wake up groggy, with your straw mattress poking into your back like an army of tiny itchy pitchforks. It smells like wool and something vaguely musky, your blanket, your shirt, and, let's be honest, probably you again. Last night's rare bath has already faded into memory. You stretch, crack your knuckles, and get ready for a delightful medieval morning ritual, using the toilet, or, more accurately, visiting the castle's garderobe, a fancy word for a vertical shaft that drops your business directly into the moat below. Yes, welcome to the sophisticated sanitation systems of the Middle Ages, where your waste becomes the moat monster's midnight snack. Castles and manors usually had these chute-style toilets built into exterior walls. You sit on a cold stone seat, if you're lucky enough to have one, and do your thing. Below you is a narrow drop, sometimes 20 or 30 feet, that leads directly to the outside. The smell is, of course, ungodly. You try to breathe through your mouth, but that only helps a little. And on cold mornings like this, steam rises, so that's pleasant. For peasants, it's even more rustic. You head outside to the communal pit latrine, which is basically a trench with a wooden plank over it. Privacy is a luxury you don't really expect. In some villages there are chamber pots, ceramic bowls for night use, emptied each morning by whoever drew the short straw. Or you just walk to the edge of your garden and hope the neighbours aren't looking. Either way, you've got a system, and you don't ask too many questions about where it all ends up. Here's your historical fun fact. Some wealthier castles designed their garderobes with chutes that emptied over running water, often a stream or small river. Engineers of the time understood just enough about flow to make gravity work for them. Unfortunately, this meant that entire cities often used their rivers as trash disposal systems. And guess what also came from rivers? Drinking water, which leads to some awkward consequences, but we'll get to that later. Quirky detail for tonight? In some castles, people stored their clothes inside the garderobe. Yep, inside the toilet room. Why? Because the smell was so overpowering it drove away moths and insects that might nibble on their expensive woolen linen. So in a bizarre medieval logic twist, the nastiest room in the house doubled as a closet. You're welcome for that mental image. Now, of course, there's a long-running scholarly debate about how well these systems actually worked. Some argue that medieval sanitation was shockingly advanced, especially compared to what came later in the crowded, disease-ridden cities of the Industrial Age. Others think this is wildly overblown, and that most people lived ankle-deep in filth and just didn't know any better. The truth, as usual, sits uncomfortably in between. People did what they could with what they had, and what they had was usually a bucket and the vague hope that rain would eventually wash everything downhill. After handling your business, you wash your hands, maybe. Water's not always easy to come by, and soap is reserved for special occasions. You might have a basin of greyish water left over from yesterday's laundry, so you splash a bit on your fingers, shake them dry, and call it good enough. Hygiene isn't about perfection here. It's about not actively offending the people you have to sit next to in church. You head outside, breathing in the sharp scent of early morning smoke and manure. The streets are dirt, and every now and then someone tosses a bucket of waste out the window with a shouted warning. You've learned to walk close to the walls and never stop under an open window. That's just survival instinct now. Cities, if you live in one, are even worse. Narrow alleyways, overhanging upper floors, and gutters running down the middle of the street. Not for rain, but for everything else. The town crier might wander by, clanging his bell and shouting the news, his boots splashing through something that definitely isn't water. You turn your head, pretending not to notice. You've probably heard people say that medieval folks were filthy, unwashed, and had no concept of cleanliness. That's only partly true. They wanted to be clean, they just didn't have the resources or infrastructure for it. Water had to be hauled by hand. Heating it took time and fuel. Soap had to be made from animal fat and ashes, and honestly it stank. So people got creative. Rose water for hand scenting, herbs tucked into clothes to mask odour, perfumed gloves if you were really fancy. In a world where cleanliness was effort, smelling halfway decent was an art form. And then there's the social angle. Smell wasn't just about hygiene, it was about class. The rich could afford more baths, better soap, fancier perfumes. The poor, they just got used to it. In fact, some people believed that too much bathing was bad for your health. They thought hot water opened your pores and let disease in, so being too clean, suspicious, possibly dangerous. As usual, medieval life is one big contradiction wrapped in wool. By midday, you've long since stopped thinking about the morning toilet experience. Your shoes are coated in something you'd rather not analyse. Your hands are dry and gritty, and someone nearby has just emptied a chamber pot from the second story. You don't flinch. This is normal. Your sense of smell has become your greatest ally and worst enemy. But you're surviving. You've learned to dodge puddles, recognise the sound of a bucket being lifted, and instinctively hold your breath near taverns and butcher shops. Not because of what they sell, though that's part of it, but because of what people do in the alley behind them when no one's looking. So now you know. Toilets in the Middle Ages, primitive, foul, but, shockingly, clever in their own rustic way. Gravity did most of the heavy lifting, and a strong breeze took care of the rest. And as you crawl back into bed tonight, with the wind howling outside and the faint aroma of moat drifting in from the guardrobe corner, just be thankful you're not on chamber pot duty this week. You wake before sunrise again, because the rooster doesn't believe in weekends. The air is chilly and smells faintly of wood smoke, old bread, and something more, organic. Your legs are stiff, your neck's sore from sleeping on a sack of old rags, and your dreams were filled with oddly vivid images of collapsing privies. But today's adventure is a bit more refined, or depending on your definition of refined, a whole new flavour of discomfort. You've got to make your way to the communal latrine at the monastery, and this time there's a little surprise waiting, the infamous bathroom scroll. You find yourself in a stone-walled chamber with narrow slits of light filtering through high windows. The floor is cool beneath your bare feet, and the air carries that now familiar mixture of damp linen and spiritual resignation. This is no ordinary lavatory, this is where the monks go, and what you notice first isn't the row of wooden seats built into the stone, or the echo of water running in the channel below. No, it's the scroll hanging from a rusty nail in the wall. The communal bathroom scroll, or what we'd call toilet paper if we were feeling incredibly generous, is a shared rag. Made of linen, if you're lucky, rough wool if you're not. Its job is to make you question everything you've ever known about personal boundaries and sanitation. After your business, you reach for it gingerly, trying not to think about who used it last. You tell yourself that the monks are clean, that they probably rotate the cloth, that there's maybe a system. But you know deep down, there is no system, just quiet faith and strong stomachs. Here's the historical fact that might make you blink in the dark a few times. Monasteries often had surprisingly advanced sanitation. Some even featured running water systems, with latrines built over flowing streams that whisked waste away. In places like Cluny Abbey in France, there were entire architectural designs dedicated to cleanliness, because monks took hygiene surprisingly seriously. After all, cleanliness was next to godliness, as long as it didn't involve soap too often. But even with all that divine plumbing, the communal wiping situation leaves much to be desired. Medieval toilet hygiene was based on the idea of reusability, not disposability. Cloth rags, hay, moss, sticks, even handfuls of snow, all fair game. If you were feeling fancy and near the coast, seashells were an option. Smooth ones, hopefully. In cities, people sometimes use scraps of parchment or old book pages. There's something poetic about wiping with a failed manuscript, isn't there? And now for your quirky fringe fact of the night. In some monastic communities there were official latrine schedules. Monks followed strict routines for everything, including bathroom breaks. Bells rang to signal different parts of the day, and even bowel movements had their allotted time slots. Imagine having your daily moment of relief, dictated by a bell tower, and enforced with the same zeal as prayer or fasting. Your whole digestive system ends up bowing to the rule of Saint Benedict. This brings us to an oddly fascinating scholarly debate. Some historians argue that medieval monasteries were among the cleanest places in Europe, maybe even cleaner than many secular homes for centuries after. Others suggest that the reputation is romanticised, based more on rare surviving documents than on actual grime-level comparisons. After all, it's one thing to have water channels and designated rags, it's another to change them regularly. You finish your business as quickly as possible, tying your belt back over your robe and giving the cloth scroll a suspicious side-eye as you shuffle toward the door. Outside, the morning mist is curling across the flagstones. A monk passes you with a nod, holding a small pail of herbs, likely destined for the communal basins. Lavender and mint if you're lucky. Sage and something bitter if not. It's their version of air freshener. You think about the quiet efficiency of this place. The monks live in silence, their lives dictated by prayer, manual labour, and the relentless tick of time. Well, bells anyway. There's comfort in the predictability. You always know what's coming, even if it's mildly horrifying. Like when you realise that communal meals mean communal cups. That's right. You're about to drink from a shared goblet, and suddenly the bathroom scroll feels like a warm-up act. But back to the latrine. You've learned something important this morning. There's such a thing as too much closeness. Shared spiritual values? Wonderful. Shared wiping fabric? Less so. You wander through the cloister gardens, trying to shake the lingering feeling of that coarse linen rag. The flowers are in bloom. Roses, marigolds, and some scraggly-looking lavender growing near the herb wall. Bees buzz lazily in the morning sun, and the world feels weirdly peaceful. You take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and try not to imagine the cloth scroll flapping softly in the breeze behind you. A quick detour for context. Medieval people had a surprisingly nuanced relationship with cleanliness. Personal hygiene was tied up with moral purity. Too much focus on the body was considered vain, even sinful, but letting yourself go completely wasn't ideal either. Monks were expected to bathe about 4 times a year. That's once per season, give or take. Though some took advantage of their medical exemptions to sneak in an extra soak or two. Imagine the thrill of a secret bath, scandalous. And so you re-enter your day, stomach faintly rumbling, head buzzing with the many small indignities of medieval life. You can't shake the knowledge that somewhere, in some stone chamber, that scroll is still hanging there, waiting, not even washed, just rotated. But tonight, when you're drifting off to sleep under the same blanket you've had since last Michaelmas, maybe you'll remember the quiet dignity of the monastic routine, the calm bells, the flowers, the rhythm. Just try not to remember the rag. You're up again, if you ever really slept. Morning in the Middle Ages doesn't offer much in the way of comfort. Your muscles creak like the wooden beams above your head, and you wipe something crusty from the corner of your mouth with a sleeve that definitely doesn't qualify as clean. Your teeth feel fuzzy. You run your tongue along them and pause, wondering, is this normal? It is now. Time for your medieval dental care routine, which is less minty fresh confidence, and more scour your face with a stick and pray. First, you reach for your tooth cleaning tool. It's not a toothbrush, not unless you're imagining a splintered stick whittled to a frayed end. That's your chewing stick, your miswak, your oral hygiene solution if you want to be generous. You chew one end until it splits into tiny fibres, then you rub it along your teeth. It tastes like bark, because it is bark, or root, or maybe a leftover twig from the firewood pile. Either way, it's mildly abrasive and gives your gum something to complain about. If you're lucky, you have something to smear on it. A tooth powder, maybe. Tonight's blend. Crushed charcoal, powdered ash, maybe dried rosemary if you're feeling fancy. Add a few grains of salt for texture, and you're ready for the medieval version of whitening strips. Only instead of brightening your smile, it mostly just stings. You spit a few gritty flecks onto the floor, wince at the taste, and remind yourself that this is still better than doing nothing. Historical fact to chew on. Pun fully intended. People did care about their teeth in the Middle Ages. Maybe not with the kind of obsessive zeal seen in modern floss commercials, but dental hygiene wasn't ignored. Recipes for tooth powders show up in medieval texts. Some included mint, sage, or even burnt breadcrumbs. There were mouth rinses too, made from vinegar, wine, or herbal infusions meant to freshen the breath and possibly scare away demons, depending on the region. You glance in a polished metal plate, your closest thing to a mirror, and take stock. Your teeth are not great. A few are dark around the edges, one looks suspiciously loose, and the gum line is retreating like it owes someone money. But you're doing okay. You still have most of them, which in this era is practically a flex. And now, the quirky fact of the night. People didn't actually walk around with black rotting teeth as often as pop culture makes it seem. Sugar was rare and expensive. Unless you were nobility drowning in imported sweets, your diet was heavy on grains, veggies, and occasional meat. Not exactly a cavity carnival. So while teeth did wear down from grit in bread and poor technique, the average peasant might have had better teeth than later generations addicted to sugar and tobacco. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. Still, when dental problems did hit, and they did, it was an ordeal. Toothaches were treated with everything from herbal poultices to spells muttered under the breath. If things got really bad, out came the dental tools, which looked more like torture instruments than anything else. The tooth key was a common extraction device, a metal hook and crank that yanked the offending molar out with as much grace as a blacksmith pulling nails. Anesthetics. Oh no, friend, you get a stick to bite and the vague promise of God's mercy. This brings us to the open debate among scholars. How often did people actually lose teeth in the Middle Ages? Some skeletons show decent dentition, while others suggest widespread wear, decay and infections. The truth probably depends on location, diet and access to remedies, or how long you lived. If you died at 30, your teeth didn't have time to fall out. Problem solved? Back in your daily routine, you rinse your mouth with a bit of wine, not because you're fancy, but because water's not always clean, and wine at least makes your breath smell like you've got a job. You swish it around like you've seen the village priest do, then spit discreetly into a bucket that definitely hasn't been emptied since Tuesday. You run a cloth across your face, a thin scrap soaked in rosewater maybe, or just slightly damp from the morning dew. No soap here. It dries your cheeks and leaves a faint whiff of something herbal, masking the real aroma of old sweat, wood smoke, and shared living quarters. You smooth your hair back under a linen coif or woolen cap, depending on your station. Hair washing happens once every few weeks, with cold water and a bracing slap to the ego. Until then, a head covering does the trick. There's something oddly comforting in the repetition. Clean teeth, sort of. Clean face, close enough. No one's expecting you to sparkle. You just need to look alive enough to work, which is the baseline standard for appearance in this era. You tie your tunic, check your belt pouch, and head out into the world with the quiet confidence of someone who's unlikely to be judged for gingivitis. As you pass your neighbours, you realise everyone's on the same page. No one's teeth are perfect, everyone smells a bit earthy, and nobody's thinking about floss. You nod to a passing woman who's chewing a sprig of mint, not for fun but for breath freshening. Practical and refreshing, if slightly bitter. Maybe you'll try it later. You go about your day with a mouth that feels less like a swamp and more like a gravel path. And that's an improvement. You may not have toothpaste, a mirror, or even a reliable toothbrush, but you've got bark, ash, and persistence. That's enough. And tonight, when you settle into your creaky straw bed and yawn into the darkness, remember that your teeth survived another day. They may be crooked, gritty, and slightly haunted, but they're yours. And in the Middle Ages, that's about as good as it gets. By now, you've accepted that the Middle Ages isn't exactly a luxury resort. You've grown used to the scent of your own armpits. You've mastered the dodging of falling chamber pot contents, and your teeth are holding on through sheer willpower. But today, your scalp itches. Not a passing itch. Not a maybe it's dry kind of thing. No, this is a persistent, almost philosophical sort of itch. The kind that makes you reconsider your choices, your hygiene, your place in the world. It's time to talk about hair washing, or more accurately, the medieval reluctance toward it. You sit on a stool in the corner of a drafty room while someone pours a small basin of water over your head. It's cold. There's no soap, at least not the foamy kind you're used to. Instead, there's a gritty greyish paste made from crushed herbs and possibly wood ash. It smells earthy, like someone tried to invent shampoo using moss and stubborn optimism. Hair washing isn't a daily affair. It isn't even weekly. Depending on your station in life and how much you sweat, it might be a monthly indulgence, or an annual event if you're on the lower rungs. You might spot a noble lady brushing her hair by the window, coating it in rose oil to add scent and gloss. But she's not washing it, not with water. Wet hair is risky after all. Catching a chill could lead to fever, and fever could lead to death. The logic's a little flawed, but you live in a world where medical advice is passed down from a monk with a book full of diagrams and no practical training. So most people take the safe route. Hide the hair, you tuck it under a linen coif, a tight-fitting cap that absorbs oil and shields your head from dust, lice, and the constant parade of smells that make up medieval street life. For women, there are veils, wimples, and headscarves. For men, hoods and hats, not fashion statements, practical armour against public judgment and crawling things. Here's a historical fact to detangle your thoughts. Combing was considered a form of purification. Monks, nuns, and clergy often included hair combing in their morning routines. It was both hygienic and spiritual, cleanliness of the body reflecting cleanliness of the soul. Combs were made of bone, horn, or wood, intricately carved and passed down like heirlooms. People didn't just yank them through their hair. They combed slowly, carefully, often while praying or reciting psalms. It was a ritual, a way to start the day with order, even if your life involved pig farming and cold porridge. But of course, even the most sacred comb can't prevent everything. Which brings us to lice, your new tiny roommates. They're not optional. You're almost guaranteed to have some crawling through your hair like tourists at a medieval fair. If you're wealthy, you have a servant or maid whose job includes nitpicking, quite literally. If you're not, you do it yourself, muttering curses and hoping no one notices you scratching behind your ear for the 10th time. Time for your quirky fringe fact. Medieval people sometimes shaved parts of their heads to keep lice under control. Not bald, necessarily, though monks did have that famous tonsure, the donut hair look. But even outside religious orders, trimming hair short or shaving it outright was a practical choice, especially during outbreaks of lice or plague. Less hair meant fewer hiding places. Of course, that also meant more headwear to compensate, because no one wanted to walk around exposing a scalp in public unless they were making a serious spiritual point. Now, the academic debate. Did medieval people really avoid washing their hair? Or is that just modern myth-making? Some historians argue that hair care was more common than we think, that people regularly used herbs, oils and rinses to maintain their locks. Others suggest that yes, most of the population was greasy, itchy and covered in various crawling passengers. The truth is probably that hair care varied wildly depending on wealth, region, climate and social norms. In places with access to herbs, warm weather and water, people did more. In colder, drier regions, not so much. You finish your wash, if we can call it that, by squeezing your hair out with a cloth that feels only marginally less grimy than your scalp. There's no hairdryer, obviously. No towel turban tutorial. You simply sit near the hearth and let the smoke do double duty, drying your hair while adding the unique fragrance of ash, soot, and medieval soup to your already complex aroma. As your hair slowly stiffens into a crunchy sort of halo, you braid it or wrap it and tuck it out of sight. Out of mind, if you're lucky. Maybe tomorrow you'll sprinkle some rosemary powder in there, or lavender, or just a bit of flour to soak up the oil. No one will judge you. In fact, you'll smell better than most. Throughout the day you catch glimpses of other people's hair, unwashed, uncut, unbothered. Children run wild with tangled locks that have never seen a comb. Older women tie back thin grey strands with scraps of ribbon or twine. A nobleman with oiled curls passes on horseback, his hair perfumed and absurdly shiny, and you suppress the urge to scratch your scalp again. Some people care, most people cope, and tonight as you lie back against your straw-stuffed pillow, you feel the cool air drifting through the open shutters. Your hair is still damp in places, still smelling faintly of rosemary and smoke, but for once, it doesn't itch, and that's enough. You close your eyes and think, you survived another wash. You may have lice, you may have used firewood runoff as conditioner, but you're cleanish. That's the medieval promise, just clean enough to keep going. You wake to the sound of bells. Again. Not a soft, pleasant chime, but a deep, echoing clang that tells you it's another holy day, or market day, or just get out of bed before the bread's gone day. Either way, your stomach's growling, and that means it's time to venture into the realm of medieval food. You're hoping for something warm, maybe something that doesn't smell like old boots, but you already know better. Breakfast is not going to be glamorous. You shuffle toward the hearth where the morning meal is underway. If you're a peasant, breakfast is simple. A thick hunk of coarse bread and a cup of ale. Not a frosty pint or anything artisanal, just warm, yeasty liquid that smells like fermented grain and faint barnyard. It's low in alcohol and brewed to be safe to drink, since the water around here is more of a health threat than a thirst quencher. And no, you're not getting eggs. Eggs are expensive and the chickens are temperamental this time of year. You gnaw your bread with quiet resolve, knowing this is probably the best it's going to get today. If you're a monk, breakfast is regulated. Probably oat porridge, and not the sweet cinnamon kind. Think greyish mush with the consistency of regret. It's bland, hot, and completely joyless, exactly as intended. Maybe they throw in a few dried peas if someone's feeling wild, and of course no meat. It's a fasting day. They're all fasting days if you're religious enough. Now, if you happen to be among the noble class, lucky you. Breakfast is optional. Some nobles skip it entirely, preferring a light snack before the midday meal. But if it is served, you might enjoy soft cheese, a bit of fruit if it's in season, or delicate pastries soaked in honey. And of course, more ale. Always ale. Water is the enemy. Historical fact of the day. Breakfast wasn't universally accepted as a necessary meal. In fact, for many medieval people, especially the upper class, it was considered a bit lowbrow. Something for children, the sick, or labourers who had to get up early and work hard. Real adults, especially those with titles and land, waited for the midday meal. Breakfast was just a utilitarian snack, calories in, no questions asked. But let's get to the real fun, the endless monotony of fish on Fridays. If it's Friday, you're not allowed to eat meat. The church said so. Fish, however, doesn't count as meat. It swims, and that makes it spiritually neutral, at least by medieval logic. So every Friday, and on a lot of other days deemed non-meat by religious calendars, you eat fish. Not fresh fish, mind you, not grilled salmon or lemony cod. No, you get preserved fish, most often salted herring that's been soaking in brine for what feels like years. The salt hits your tongue before anything else. Then the texture, rubbery, chewy, aggressively fishy. You tear into it like someone chewing through a leather belt soaked in seawater. There's no escaping it. Salted fish is everywhere. It fills the kitchen, your breath, and your dreams. You wash it down with ale, again, and try not to gag. Fasting for your sins has never tasted so bland. Quirky medieval food, fact for the night. In parts of Europe, beaver was considered acceptable for Lenten meals. Why? Because it lived in water, had a flat tail, and people decided, very conveniently, that it counted as a fish. Same for barnacle geese, those mysterious birds that people believed hatched from driftwood floating in the sea. If it touched water, it was probably not real meat. Problem solved. Faith and loopholes, always a winning combo. Now here's a scholarly debate to chew on. How nutritious were medieval diets, really? Some argue that peasants ate healthier than we imagine. Lots of whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and occasional dairy. It wasn't exciting, but it covered the basics. Others point out that famine, nutrient deficiencies, and poor harvests were so common that most people lived in a constant state of semi-starvation. The truth: it depended on where you lived, what class you were, and whether your harvest came through. In a good year you were full. In a bad year you boiled shoe leather and called it stew. Back at your table you finish your meal with another slice of dark bread. It's dense, with grains so roughly ground that you sometimes crunch on bits of grit. That's not an accident. Medieval mills often let small bits of stone into the flour, which means every bite is slowly sanding your teeth down to medieval nubs. No wonder no one smiles in old paintings. Lunch will be more of the same, maybe a pottage, which is basically a slow-cooked stew of whatever was lying around. Cabbage, beans, leftover salted meat, if it's a feast day, and a handful of herbs. It simmers over the fire all day, thickens into a sort of vegetable paste, and gets ladled out in chipped wooden bowls. Everyone eats from the same pot. Everyone uses the same spoon if you're not careful. The concept of cross-contamination hasn't been invented yet. You glance around and realise that food isn't just about nutrition here. It's about order. There are rules for who eats what and when. The church calendar dictates half your meals. Seasons determine the rest. There's no such thing as late-night snacking or sneaking a chocolate bar. You eat what there is, when there is, and how you're allowed to. Still, you can't help but wonder what it would be like to have choices. To wake up and think, eggs or toast, fruit or cereal. But you shake the thought from your head. It's the 14th century, and salted herring doesn't ask for your opinion. So tonight, when you curl up under your scratchy blanket with your belly full of barley mush and dried peas, think about this. Medieval food may have been repetitive, bland, and occasionally questionably legal. Looking at you, Beaver. But it kept people alive. Barely. And in a world where survival is the highest luxury, that's a 5-star meal. It's midday now, and the sun's climbing higher, filtering through a patchy cloud cover that does nothing to cut the chill in the air. The fields are still damp. Your tunic is sticking to your back in that special way wool always does when it decides to turn against you, and your stomach is once again considering mutiny. But this next stop on your medieval journey isn't about hunger. It's about flavour. Or more precisely, the magical, ridiculously expensive and mildly suspicious world of medieval spices. You trudge toward the marketplace, clutching a little coin pouch tied to your belt. It jingles softly, maybe 2 pennies and a shard of broken pottery someone swore was good luck. You're not here for meat or vegetables. Those are for people who can afford to buy more than turnips and yesterday's onion. You're here for something far more mysterious. Pepper. In the medieval world, black pepper is gold. Not metaphorically. It is quite literally worth its weight in silver. Whole wars are fought over the trade routes that bring it from India. Ships are loaded with it. Men die for it. Kings hoard it in tiny locked chests. And here you are, standing in front of a spice merchant who looks at you like your boots might steal from him. You peer down at a display of tiny wooden boxes. There's cinnamon. True cinnamon, not the cheap cousin. And nutmeg and cloves. They smell divine, like warmth and mystery in distant places you'll never visit. The merchant offers you a sniff of ginger, and you nearly sneeze your nose into another century. You ask how much for a pinch of pepper, and he names a price that's somewhere between absolutely not and do you accept kidneys? Still, you can't deny it. The rich love their spices. A dish isn't complete without some exotic powder that came halfway across the globe. Entire kitchens exist just to grind, mix and blend spices into sauces that mask the taste of meat that might be slightly off. Spices aren't just flavour, they're status. If your food is bland, it means you're poor. If it smells like a Moroccan bazaar exploded on your roast chicken, congratulations, you've arrived. Here's your historical flavour bomb. In the 14th century, a pound of saffron could cost more than a horse. That's right. You could either ride into town or garnish your stew. Not both. Merchants carried spice packets in locked boxes like they were transporting royal treasure. And in a way they were. Spices didn't just transform food, they transformed identity. They marked you as elite, worldly, powerful enough to conquer blandness itself. Of course, most people couldn't afford them. You, for instance. Your spice rack is a handful of dried parsley, maybe some mustard seed, and if you're really lucky, a few dried peppercorns you guard like dragon eggs. To stretch your stash, you might grind old spices with stale breadcrumbs to make a fake powder fort seasoning. Does it taste good? Not really, but it makes the neighbours think you've got connections. Quirky fact of the day, pepper was sometimes used as currency. Rent payments could be made in spices, fines settled in cloves or cinnamon. Some guilds required dues to be paid in nutmeg. It sounds ridiculous now, but in a world without refrigeration, spices were more than flavour. They were preservation, medicine and image management all rolled into one fragrant pinch. Now, let's sprinkle in a scholarly debate. Did medieval folks really use spices to cover the taste of spoiled meat? That's the popular myth, but historians argue it's mostly nonsense. Spices were far too expensive to waste on bad food. If meat was spoiled, it was tossed, or used to feed the servants. Spices were used to enhance, not disguise. The wealthy wanted delicious, not just edible. So while your cousin might sprinkle some ginger on a questionable sausage, the nobility were more interested in making their pigeon pie taste like a Venetian vacation. You walk past a stall selling powder douce, a spice blend used in sweet dishes, and then powder fort, which adds a punch to meat. Every family has their own mix, some sweeter, some spicier, depending on what's available and what the cook can hoard. Recipes are passed down, guarded like sacred texts, and if you're especially bold, you might sneak in your own creation. A bit of dried thyme, a touch of honey, a pinch of the one expensive spice you can afford, all mashed into a mysterious blend that will either elevate your dinner or ruin it entirely. Back at home, or wherever you eat, you sprinkle your hard-earned pinch of pepper on tonight's stew. It's barely enough to notice, but it's there. You stir slowly, imagining yourself as someone with a spice chest of your own, a full larder, a kitchen servant whose only job is to grind cinnamon until his fingers are permanently scented. You inhale. The stew still smells mostly like turnips and boiling regret, but somewhere in there, faint and bold and defiant, is the bite of pepper. You savour it. You sit with it. You mentally calculate whether you can afford more next week. Probably not. But tonight, you've got flavour. Real flavour. Imported, exotic, painfully expensive flavour. And as you crawl into your straw bed, belly full and lips still tingling faintly from that rare touch of spice, you can almost pretend you're noble, or at least noblish. And maybe that's enough. Because in the Middle Ages, pepper isn't just seasoning, it's hope, it's identity, it's you, fighting the blandness one pinch at a time. Evening sets in with that familiar medieval pace, slow, smoky and heavy with the scent of boiled barley and wet wool. The sun dips behind the thatched rooftops, casting everything in that golden grey haze that looks romantic in paintings, but mostly just means your chores aren't done yet. You're sitting by the hearth, still digesting your mostly turnip dinner with the glorious trace of pepper you splurged on when someone brings out the bread. But not just any bread. This is dark, dense, and a little too suspiciously hard. You take a bite and pause. Something's off. Not just in taste, but in reality, congratulations. Tonight, you're about to have a casual brush with hallucinogenic food poisoning. Medieval bread isn't exactly fluffy. You don't walk into a bakery and come out with a crusty artisan baguette in a paper sleeve. No, your bread is more of a slab, coarse, dark, and filled with mystery. It's made from rye, mostly, because wheat is for the rich. Rye grows better in northern climates, and it's cheaper. But here's the kicker. Rye comes with risks. If the harvest was wet or improperly stored, it can develop a sneaky little fungus called Clavieps purpurea. You may know it by its villain name, ergot. You chew. The bread tastes earthy, almost sour. Not terrible, not great, just bread. Then the edge of your vision does something weird. Your fingertips start to tingle, and suddenly, the floor seems a little further away than you remember. Welcome to your unplanned medieval acid trip, courtesy of contaminated grain. Here's your historical fact. Ergot poisoning was a very real and terrifying phenomenon in the Middle Ages, especially in areas where rye bread was a staple. People didn't know it was a fungus. They just knew that sometimes entire villages would fall into spasms, hallucinations, fits of madness, or worse. The disease earned several nicknames over the centuries, St. Anthony's Fire being one of the most dramatic. Skin turned red and raw, limbs went numb, some people died, others just wandered around in a daze claiming to see demons. Medieval Monday. You put the bread down, belatedly, and sip your ale trying to anchor yourself. Around you, no one seems worried, because this happens from time to time. Some years are worse than others. People say it's a punishment or a curse or maybe just a bad omen. You, meanwhile, try to focus on the fire while your brain insists it's turning into a small judgmental rabbit. Here's a weird fringe fact for tonight's sleep file. Some historians and scientists have speculated that historical outbreaks of ergot poisoning may have been behind events like the Salem witch trials. The logic goes, rye bread plus hallucinogens plus cultural paranoia equals a lot of accusations and some very unfortunate bonfires. It's still debated, but the connection between mouldy grain and mass hysteria is at least plausible enough to be unsettling. Speaking of debate, here's a chewy one. Scholars still argue over how widespread ergotism really was. Some say it was common, affecting thousands in poor harvest years. Others argue that it's been exaggerated in modern retellings, that it wasn't as frequent as pop history makes it sound. The trouble is, medieval people didn't exactly have forensic toxicology. When a town full of people started twitching and seeing visions, they didn't send samples to a lab. They prayed, panicked, and possibly blamed a goat. You blink, and your vision steadies. Probably just your imagination. Or maybe the ale's stronger than usual. Either way, you're back in the room, watching the bread be passed around again. You decline politely, you've had enough mind-bending fungus for one day. Still, bread is essential. You can't escape it. It's the cornerstone of every meal, no matter your class. Nobles get soft white loaves, fine manchet bread made with sifted flour. You get something denser. Rye, barley, oats, sometimes all mixed together. Bread is so central to life that it's often used as a plate. Trenchers, they're called. Thick slabs of stale bread you pile stew or meat onto. After the meal, the juice-soaked slabs are tossed to the poor, the dogs, or the compost heap. Bread has range. You also learn to spot the difference between good bread and pray for mercy bread. If it smells sour, has purple streaks, or makes your hands go numb, maybe don't eat it. But choices are limited. When your body's begging for calories, you take your chances. You tear the crust, chew slowly, and hope. Sometimes you toast it over the fire, that helps. Kills off a few things, makes it crisp. Other times you soak it in broth to soften it, but there's no avoiding it. Bread is your fuel, your comfort food, your daily risk. And in a strange way, there's something kind of poetic about that. Every bite you take is a gamble. It might feed you. It might trip you into another dimension. It might, on very rare occasions, be both. As night falls and the hearth dies down to a soft red glow, you think about how something as simple as bread can hold so much power. Power to nourish, power to harm, power to push an entire village into a spiritual crisis after lunch. You pull your blanket tighter, your breath slow and steady, and feel the strange lightness of a stomach full of just a little too much fungus. Tonight you sleep with the taste of rye still lingering, your head buzzing faintly with the idea that maybe, just maybe, that rabbit was real. But probably not. Probably. You wake up to birdsong and the dull throb of your own temples, whether it's from the ergot-laced bread, the half-stale ale, or the questionable decision to sleep with your head an inch from the hearth, you're not sure. But today feels a little heavier, a little foggier, and you've barely opened your eyes before your thoughts turn to one of life's great necessities. Water. Not for bathing, not even for washing your hands. You need a drink. But here's the catch. In the Middle Ages, drinking water is a calculated risk. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, sniff the stale air for any hint of breakfast, none yet, and head outside with a wooden mug in hand. You make your way to the village well, one of the only places where water's even remotely safe, assuming the bucket hasn't been sitting in direct sunlight for a few days, or hasn't been tampered with by someone's mischievous child or angry goat. Water isn't your first choice, it's not even your second. In fact, it's your last resort. Because everyone knows, water is dangerous, not because it's haunted, though that wouldn't be surprising, but because it's often contaminated. With what? Let's start with animal waste, then work our way down to human waste, rotting fish, runoff from the tannery, and the occasional dead cat floating downstream. Water is suspicious. It makes people sick, so you drink ale, even for breakfast. Historical fact to sip on. In the Middle Ages, ale was the drink of the people, men, women, even children. But this isn't your hoppy craft IPA. This is small ale, low in alcohol, brewed quickly, and just enough to make the water safe to consume. The fermentation process killed off a lot of the bacteria. It wasn't about getting tipsy, though that happened too. It was about surviving, and it was filling. Ale had calories, water had dysentery. You take a swig of your morning ale. It's lukewarm, slightly sour, and has a faint aftertaste of barley porridge. It's not refreshing, but it doesn't make your stomach twist into knots, and that's enough to count as a win. You lean against a wooden post and glance at the stream that runs through the edge of town. A woman downstream is scrubbing laundry. A pig is wading nearby. Someone further up just emptied a chamber pot. The circle of life, medieval edition. And here's your quirky fringe fact for the night. Some monasteries and larger estates had surprisingly advanced water systems. Aqueducts, lead pipes, yes, lead, and cisterns helped move and store cleaner water, sometimes filtered through layers of gravel or cloth. In some places, the upper class had access to water that was genuinely drinkable, clear, cold, and relatively safe. But for the average villager like you, you're drinking what everyone else bathes in, or worse. The big debate among scholars is just how aware medieval people were of water's dangers. Some argue they fully understood that certain sources were cleaner than others, using wells, springs, and rainwater catchments with care. Others think people were operating on superstition and trial and error. They knew something made them sick, but not the how or why. That's why miasma, bad air, was blamed for illness. The concept of invisible germs wouldn't appear for centuries. In the meantime, if the water smelled fine and didn't give you immediate diarrhea, it passed the test. You walk past the local brewwife's cottage. She's already at it, stirring a massive copper pot filled with bubbling wort, tossing in herbs like yarrow and mugwort to spice it. Hops are a newer addition, more common in some regions than others, but the basics remain the same: boil, ferment, and pray. You nod as you pass. She's keeping the village hydrated more reliably than any well ever has. Beer isn't the only option, though. If you're wealthier, wine might be on the table. Imported if you're rich, local and barely palatable if you're not. There's also mead, fermented honey water, and cider, especially in apple-growing regions. But ale is still king. It's brewed daily, consumed constantly, and judged not by flavour, but by whether it makes you sick. If it doesn't kill you, it's good ale. You dip a ladle into a fresh cask and take another gulp. You think about how strange it would be to drink cold, clear, flavourless water straight from a tap. The idea seems almost suspicious. Where would that water come from? Who would watch over it? Wouldn't it feel weird not to taste anything? There's something oddly comforting about the ever-present mug of ale. It gives your hand something to do. It soothes your stomach. It hides the taste of questionable stew. It makes conversation smoother, even if you're just talking to your cow. And yes, you're a little buzzed all the time. So is everyone else. It's not a problem. It's a lifestyle. You wander back home watching a child run past carrying a wooden cup of ale like it's nothing. Because it is nothing. It's normal. No one's checking IDs. No one's calling the authorities. It's not a party. It's just hydration. By the time night falls, your belly is full of broth, barley and beer. Your skin feels sticky from sweat and soot, but your thirst is quenched, and you've managed to dodge dysentery for one more day. As you settle into your itchy blanket and listen to the night sounds, frogs croaking, distant cows mooing, and someone vomiting behind the tavern, you think about how precious water really is. How strange it is to live in a world where the most basic human need is wrapped in so much risk. And as you drift off, maybe a little tipsy, maybe a little proud of your ale-crafting neighbours, you realise something very medieval and very true. In a world where water betrays you, beer is family. You wake up groggy, your mouth dry with the unmistakable cling of last night's ale and ash. Your head feels like someone's been using it as an anvil. The fire in the hearth has long since gone out, and there's a draught sneaking under the door that reminds you just how thin your blanket really is. You stretch, crack your back, and start dreading the fact that today's a feast day, not because you dislike eating, but because someone's killed a swan, and now it's your job to help cook it. Medieval feasts aren't your typical friendly dinner parties. They're theatrical, over-the-top performances with food as the headliner. And when it comes to noble households, there are rules. You don't just eat something, you display it. You parade it around the hall, you serve it with as much flair as humanly, or poultrily, possible. And that's why there's currently a dead bird on the table, stripped, roasted, and then redressed in its original feathers for dramatic effect. This, for better or worse, is dinner. You help lift the swan from the spit, its skin golden, slightly charred at the edges, and surprisingly fragrant. It's been basted with a mixture of wine, spices, and honey, because nothing says celebration like caramelizing a waterfowl. You work carefully to reattach its wings and neck feathers, arranging them so it looks majestic and only slightly cooked. The final touch, a dab of gold leaf on its beak. Because if it isn't shiny, did you even feast? Historical fact for tonight's table. Medieval banquets weren't just about food. They were displays of wealth, creativity, and culinary wizardry. A popular centrepiece might be a peacock with its feathers reattached, tail fanned out like a culinary peacock prom queen. Or maybe a pie that, when sliced open, released live birds. Literally. Not meat. Live birds. Because surprising your guests with fluttering wings and confusion is peak hospitality. These were status events. The more elaborate the dish, the higher your social flex. Nobles might not have eaten more than 3 bites, but they wanted to be seen eating it, or at least seen being served it, while musicians played lutes in the corner and servants stood rigidly by with goblets of wine and strained smiles. Meanwhile, you're in the kitchen, sweating. The heat from the hearth is intense, and the room is filled with the clashing smells of roasting meat, boiling cabbage, and a jug of suspicious fish sauce someone insists improves everything. A servant rushes past you with a tray of marzipan shaped like a castle. Someone else carries a moulded jelly dyed with beetroot and set in an actual mould shaped like a boar's head. It wobbles ominously. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Jelly moulds weren't just decorative, they were borderline medieval engineering. Creating jelly required isinglass, made from dried fish bladders, or animal bones boiled for hours. It was a labour of love or madness, or possibly a slow descent into both. But once the jelly set, it was a miracle, a status symbol, a wobbly badge of honour that said, yes, I have the time, wealth, and dead fish parts to do this. The open scholarly debate here? Just how common were these extravagant dishes? Some historians argue that they were rare, reserved for royal courts or elite households on major holidays. Others suggest that regional nobility regularly indulged in elaborate meals, at least when they could afford it, and that records we do have are just snapshots of a larger, more widespread tradition. Either way, the average peasant definitely wasn't shaping jellies or roasting swans in gold leaf. You were lucky if your stew didn't have rocks in it. Back in the hall, the feast is underway. You help carry in the main dishes, bowing low, not speaking unless spoken to. The room is loud with laughter, song, and the occasional thump of someone slapping the table in approval. The air is thick with the scent of cloves and sweat, wine and wood smoke. You glance at the long tables lined with bread trenchers, plates of roasted meats, stewed fruits, and steaming pies. There's boar with apples in its mouth, stuffed pigeons, eels arranged in a circle like a particularly upsetting crown. You aren't eating, of course, not right away. Servants eat after, and even then, only what's left. but you managed to sneak a bit of the swan's leg, a little dry, honestly, but not bad. Gamey, rich, and soaked in all those expensive spices you can't pronounce. By the end of the night, the nobles are drunk, the musicians are tired, and half the hall smells like spilled gravy. You've cleaned dishes, scrubbed goblets, and retrieved a goose someone left under the table. It honks once and waddles off like it's embarrassed. You finally sit down in the kitchen, a slice of venison in one hand and a chunk of manchet bread in the other. Someone brings you a mug of ale. You clink cups without ceremony and eat in silence, the good kind, where no one's asking you to fan them with a peacock feather, or carry another two-tiered meat pie into a room full of people who will only nibble before declaring themselves stuffed. And as you settle into sleep, full for once, actually full, you realise that while medieval feasts might be absurd, exhausting, and fueled by equal parts ego and jelly, they have their perks, mostly leftovers, but perks nonetheless. You drift off with the lingering scent of roast swan still clinging to your tunic, and dreams full of gold-dusted geese and pies that breathe. The first thing you notice this morning is heat. Not warmth, heat. A kind of itchy, unrelenting blanket of discomfort that clings to your body the second you sit up. The fire hasn't even been lit yet, but you're already sweating, because today it's summer, medieval summer, and there's no escaping it. Not in your home, not outside, and definitely not underneath the 3 layers of wool you're about to put back on like some kind of personal sauna suit. Welcome to the season of suffering. Your shirt sticks to your back before you even finish lacing it up. It's linen, technically breathable, but when you're wearing it under a thick woolen tunic and a second overdress or doublet, breathable stops being a selling point. There's no such thing as summer wear in the Middle Ages. Seasonal fashion exists, sure, but mostly for nobles who can afford to have multiple wardrobes and someone else to carry them. For you, you get what you've always worn: wool, linen, and more wool. Your entire strategy for beating the heat involves rolling up your sleeves and silently begging the wind to do you a favour. You step outside into the glare. The village smells like everything's been lightly steamed. Hay, manure, goats, people, especially people. You pass your neighbour, who nods and lifts a hand in greeting before immediately fanning themselves with a piece of broken pottery. Everyone looks slightly melted. The baker is red in the face, and someone has propped open the church doors just to let the draught in. Even the dogs are lying in the shade, tongues out, glaring at the sun like it owes them money. Here's your historical fact to sweat over. There was no concept of summer fashion in the way we think of it now. Most people had 2 or 3 sets of clothes, max, and they wore them year-round. The fabric didn't change with the seasons. You just took off what you could without being indecent, or added layers when frostbite became a threat. Lightweight fabric was rare and expensive. Cotton existed but was imported and usually reserved for the wealthy. Linen was the most breathable you could hope for, but even that came in limited supply. For the average villager, summer was just something you endured while continuing to look like a walking rug display. You pause by a well and dunk your hands in the bucket just to cool off. The water is lukewarm and vaguely murky, but it's wet, and that's good enough. You rub it over your face and neck, savouring the brief relief before it all evaporates, leaving your skin feeling weirdly sticky again. A woman nearby lifts her skirts just enough to stand barefoot in a shallow stream, sighing like it's a luxury bathhouse. You're jealous. Of course, some people were smarter about summer survival. You see a shepherd further up the hill wearing just a short tunic and no hose, his legs bare and scandalous. Children run wild in near nudity, and no one bothers to stop them. Because at a certain point, modesty is no match for sweat. Now for your quirky fringe fact of the night. Medieval people believed sweat was a kind of purification. It wasn't just a gross side effect of being alive, it was your body getting rid of bad humours. That meant sweating was, in a strange way, healthy. People would sometimes encourage sweating as a way to cure illness. Enter the sweat bath, essentially a steam room without the eucalyptus or the luxury. Herbs were burned, water was ladled over hot stones, and people roasted themselves in enclosed huts hoping to banish their fevers and sins. Basically, medieval saunas, but with more prayers and fewer towels. Scholars still argue about whether people really just suffered through the heat, or if they had cleverer ways of coping that we've lost to time. Some suggest that architectural features, thick stone walls, shaded courtyards, high windows, helped cool homes more than we assume. Others argue that most people didn't even try to beat the heat. They just slowed down, stayed indoors when they could, and waited for the sun to give up and go down. Back in your cottage, you're trying to stay still. Movement equals sweat. You sit by the open window praying for a breeze and sip watered-down ale. The heat presses in from all sides. The rush of chores slows to a crawl. Even the chickens have called it a day. Someone bangs on a pan outside to scare crows off the grain and nearly gives you a heat-stroke-induced heart attack. Midday comes, and the entire village looks half dead. It's too hot to cook, so meals are light. Maybe some cheese, a slice of cold bread, some pickled vegetables that have survived in a cool corner. If you're lucky, someone's found berries, but those spoil fast. The idea of hot stew or roasted meat is unbearable. You chew slowly, sweat dripping into your eyebrows, wondering if you can bribe a priest to declare the sun a sin. By late afternoon, you've accepted that you'll never be dry again. The cloth at your neck is permanently damp, and your feet squish in your shoes. You consider pulling off your hose like the shepherd earlier, but you're not quite ready for that level of freedom or social risk. Instead, you rinse your face again, tie your hair up, and try not to move unless absolutely necessary. Evening brings some relief. The air cools by a few precious degrees. You hear laughter from the fields where the younger villagers are chasing fireflies and pretending not to notice each other. You stretch your arms, feel the breeze trickle across your skin, and it almost feels bearable again. As the stars start to appear and the heat finally fades, you lie on top of your blanket, not under it, and listen to the soft chorus of insects and distant voices. Your body aches from doing everything in wool, but you made it. You survived another day of medieval summer, wrapped in 3 layers and somehow still functional. And as you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, you think of how cool the stone floor felt under your feet earlier, and how tomorrow you just might ditch the hose and live a little. After all, in a world without fans, ice cubes or air conditioning, rebellion comes in small, sweaty acts. You wake to a new, scratchy sensation. Not the usual itchy wool or straw poking through your bedding. This is different. A slow, creeping irritation on your side like your shirt is crawling. You reach under your tunic, scratch absent-mindedly, and your fingers come away with a squashed little smear. Lovely. It's going to be one of those days. Today, we're talking about fashion, specifically the sheer tyranny of medieval clothing and what it means to be fully dressed while also fully uncomfortable from the moment you open your eyes. Let's start with the basics. Your first layer is a linen shift or chemise, depending on your gender. It's the only thing that ever touches your skin, and ideally, it gets washed regularly. Regularly, meaning once every week or two if you're particularly clean-minded or unlucky enough to be the one doing laundry. Over that, you add your next layer, a tunic or kirtle, made of heavy wool, because that's the fabric of the era. Then, if it's chilly, and it usually is, a second tunic or surcoat or a long robe. If you're stepping outside, add a cloak, possibly a hood, maybe a belt with pouches hanging off it like you're a one-person hardware store. Congratulations, you're now walking around with the heat insulation of a portable oven and none of the airflow. You tighten your belt, literally, since there are no pockets. Everything you own that's useful is dangling from your hips. Knife, flint, keys, coin pouch, possibly a religious token if you're feeling spiritually insecure today. It jangles when you move, and it digs into your side when you bend. But it's better than the alternative, which is carrying everything in your hands and looking like a complete amateur. Here's your historical fashion fact to wear into the day. Medieval clothing wasn't one size fits all, but it wasn't fast fashion either. Clothes were made by hand, often at home, and repaired endlessly. A single tunic might last years, patched and resized as needed. In wealthier circles, tailoring began to emerge, especially in the 14th century, when fitted garments became fashionable. That meant more seams, more buttons, and the birth of the fashion industry, or at least its distant, slightly grubby ancestor. You step outside and immediately begin sweating. The wool itches at your neck. Your hose, basically thick over-the-knee socks held up by a garter or a drawstring, slide down slightly with every step. You pause behind a shed to adjust them and scratch at the growing army of flea bites along your shin. You try not to think about how many other people have worn these hose before you. Clothes, after all, are valuable. They're passed down, resold, sometimes even stolen off the dead. Now for your quirky fact. In the late Middle Ages, sumptuary laws were introduced in many regions. Rules that dictated who could wear what based on class. If you were a merchant, you couldn't dress like a noble, even if you could afford to. Certain fabrics, like silk or velvet, were reserved for the elite. Fur trims? Better check your family's tax bracket. The wrong hat could get you fined. The wrong shoes? Publicly shamed. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about knowing your place. Speaking of shoes, yours are simple leather turn shoes. No heel, barely any sole, and absolutely no arch support. They're made from a single piece of leather, sewn inside out and then flipped, like a sad little glove for your foot. If you're fancy, they might be dyed or decorated. But if you're really fancy, your shoes have long curled toes, sometimes absurdly long, up to 2 feet. The longer the toe, the more status you're flexing. Of course, you also can't walk properly, and you've tripped over your own feet 6 times this morning, but that's just the price of looking successful. Here comes the scholarly debate. Just how miserable was medieval clothing, really? Some historians argue that people adapted to the materials, that wool and linen were more comfortable than we give them credit for, especially when made and worn correctly. Others insist that layering thick, scratchy fabrics in all seasons led to chronic skin issues, limited movement, and constant discomfort. Either way, no one was lounging around in sweatpants and a hoodie, unless your idea of comfort involves a full-length fur-lined cloak and the smell of damp livestock. You visit the weaver's house later in the day, where someone's making a new surcoat for the Lord's son. The process is fascinating. Wool is carded, spun into yarn, woven on a giant upright loom, and then dyed with whatever colour the Lord has decided is fashionable this year. Indigo for the rich, green for merchants, and brown for everyone else. You ask if they've got any scraps for patching your tunic's elbow. The weaver eyes you like you're trying to steal their sheep. The afternoon sun beats down, and your layered outfit becomes a private sauna again. You untie your cloak, roll up your sleeves, scandalous, and sit in the shade with a few other villagers who've similarly surrendered to the heat. Everyone is scratching. One woman pulls a flea from her bodice and flicks it into the grass with zero ceremony. You do the same with something that was definitely not a piece of thread. When evening falls, you finally start to feel human again. You peel off your outer tunic and hang it near the hearth, careful not to let it touch the fire. Burning your only overlayer would be grounds for weeping. Your shift is damp from sweat, but it's cooler than wool. You brush it out and lie down, not bothering to change. After all, nightwear doesn't exist. You sleep in what you wore. Everyone does. The same linen shirt, all day and all night, until it's visibly crunchy enough to require washing. You close your eyes, itching slightly, thinking of how your whole life is stitched together, literally. Fabric shapes everything. How you move, how you're seen, how warm you are or aren't. And as sleep creeps in, you make a mental note. Next week you're patching that hole in your cloak whether you have spare fabric or not. Because in the Middle Ages, fashion isn't about expression, it's about survival. And right now, you're one lost sock away from social collapse. The rooster screams again. You've started to suspect he's not actually telling time, just screaming for sport. Your body protests as you roll out of bed, joints crackling, muscles sore from hauling buckets and dodging nobles all week. You wince as your bare foot hits the cold stone floor, then fumble for your shoes, those same sad, flat leather things with zero cushioning and a slight smell of wet dog. You don't even think about breakfast. You've got a task this morning, and it's one that fills you with equal parts dread and shame. You have to find the pouch. Again. Pockets, as a concept, don't exist yet. Not sewn into your clothing anyway. That little miracle won't show up for a few hundred years. For now, if you want to carry anything, money, keys, that very important dried apple you've been saving for 3 days, you tie it to your belt. These pouches hang like accessories, swinging with every step and bumping against your hip like a needy toddler. Until, of course, you forget they're there and they fall off, which they do, constantly. You check under the bench, under your tunic, under your straw bed. No pouch. You retrace yesterday's steps. Market, mill, your friend's cottage, the church. Somewhere along that route, you've been pickpocketed, or just pick-pouched, which is frankly more annoying. You sigh, tie a spare scrap of linen around your belt as a makeshift bag, and hope no one notices you looking like a medieval fanny pack enthusiast. Here's your historical fact for the day. Instead of pockets, both men and women wore belts with all sorts of items dangling from them. These included small pouches for coins, knives for eating and self-defense, keys, purses, charms, flints, and even wax tablets and styluses for quick notes. Basically a full Batman utility belt in sad, soggy wool. The arrangement was practical but noisy, and it made sitting down an art form. Every time you squatted or perched, there was a small but very real chance of stabbing yourself in the thigh with your own cutlery. Women also had their own versions of this belt system. In some regions, they wore girdle belts with items like sewing kits, rosaries, and even amulets dangling from them. And no, it wasn't considered weird. Everyone jingled when they walked. The real concern was theft, because a belt pouch was just hanging there, begging to be lifted by an experienced rogue. You start walking through the village today, with your hand clamped protectively over your pouch like it's a medieval purse on a suspicious subway. The fringe fact of the day: some noblewomen had detachable sleeves, and yes, those sometimes held items too. These weren't functional like later hidden pockets, but the sleeves themselves could be swapped out, tied at the shoulder with ribbon or cord. Want a dramatic fashion change for the feast? Swap your sleeves. Want to impress someone with embroidery? Wear your nicest sleeves. Lose your pouch and need somewhere to tuck a coin? Well, if you're clever, you make it work, back to your very real, very empty stomach. You pass the bakery, and the smell hits you like a wave. Yeast, flour, heat, and comfort. You debate using one of your 2 coins to buy a half loaf. Then remember you can't find your pouch. So instead, you shuffle off, defeated, crunching a sad piece of stale bread from your sleeve. Yes, your sleeve, because when you don't have a pouch, you become very creative, and also very crumb-covered. A scholarly debate that still pops up among fashion historians is this: were medieval people really burdened by the lack of built-in pockets, or did they simply not miss what they never had? Some argue the belt and pouch system was entirely efficient for its time. Others point out how frequently people lost things, how often written complaints about pickpocketing appear in court records, and how the eventual invention of sewn-in pockets in the 17th century was treated like the wheel reinvented. You tend to side with the latter. Later in the day you do find your pouch. It's hanging on a fence post near the mill, just where you probably left it while picking up grain. Inside, 2 pennies, a broken button, and your apple. You mutter a soft thank you to whatever saint watches over forgetful peasants, then tie the pouch back to your belt with a double knot so tight it could outlast a siege. Walking back, your pouches bump and jingle against your thigh. You notice the same rhythm in the people around you. The smith's tools, the cooper's hammer, the baker's measuring scoop. Everyone carries their life around their waist. If you want to know someone's job or social rank, you just look at the belt. Nobles have gilded daggers, jewelled pomanders filled with rose petals, or ornate keys to locked chests. You've got your coins, a sharp little knife, and that apple. It's enough. As the sun dips and you settle in for the evening, you untie your belt and hang it near your bed. It creaks slightly as it lets go of the day's weight. You stretch your arms, feel the freedom of your waist unburdened for the first time since dawn, and smile. You may not have a pocket, but you've got a system, and in this era that's more than most. So tonight, as you curl into your rough linen sheet with your pouch safely tied to a nail beside your bed, you dream of the future, of buttons, of zippers, of trousers with built-in places for your things. But for now you sleep with your belt close, your apple closer, and the knowledge that tomorrow you'll remember to tie it extra tight. The rooster, as always, offers no reprieve. You squint into the grey morning light and groan softly, shoulders sore from a night spent half wrapped in your blanket and half fighting for pillow space with the edge of a wooden board. But today feels different. Not because something exciting is about to happen, don't get your hopes up, but because you slept in your undergarments. Or more accurately, you just didn't take them off, and that in this world counts as being ready for bed. You sit up and stretch, linen sticking to your skin. Your undergarment, also called a shift or a shirt, is the only layer that ever really touches your body. It's long, loose, off-white, or grey, let's be honest, and made of linen that once might have been soft but now feels like an exfoliation treatment every time you move. It's not sleepwear, it's just your everything wear. You wear it under your clothes during the day and alone at night, assuming you're sleeping indoors and not on the floor of a barn next to a goat named Agnes. There's no separate drawer full of pyjamas, no cosy flannels, no cartoon prints, no oversized band shirts from festivals that never happened. In fact, there's no drawer at all. You have 1 or 2 shifts to your name, and one of them is drying over a beam after yesterday's emergency delousing session. So you wear the clean one, or at least the less smelly one. Here's your historical fact to snuggle into. Nightclothes as we think of them didn't really exist for most people in the Middle Ages. Wealthy folks might have had designated nightshirts or gowns, especially later in the period, but for the average person, there was no real distinction between daywear and sleepwear, just layers. You wore less to bed, but rarely nothing, unless you were very hot, very drunk, or very dead. You swing your feet over the side of the bed and wince. The floor is cold and your shirt doesn't reach far enough to save your ankles. You shuffle toward the basin and splash a little water on your face. The shirt clings to your body, damp and slightly scratchy. It's seen better days, and possibly other people's bodies before yours. Clothes, especially linen shifts, were often shared, mended and passed down like family heirlooms, except instead of holding sentimental value they hold everything else. And now for your quirky fringe fact. Some monasteries and noble households actually had bed linens, and even early versions of pyjamas in the form of linen nightgowns. But these were rare and considered signs of wealth or extreme devotion to personal comfort, both of which made you slightly suspicious in the eyes of your average neighbour. A nobleman lounging in a clean linen gown with a feather-stuffed pillow might be seen as elegant. You, trying that same thing with your patched shift and burlap cushion, would just be considered eccentric. Or possessed. There's some scholarly debate about just how often people slept in the nude. Some suggest it was more common in warmer regions or in summer, especially among lower classes who couldn't afford spare linen. Others argue that sleeping naked was considered improper, even sinful in most areas, with some religious texts warning against being caught unclothed before the Lord. Then again, if you shared a room with 6 people and a goat, modesty wasn't your top priority. You get dressed over your shift, pulling on your tunic and adjusting your belt. The shift stays on until laundry day, or until it becomes sentient and walks away on its own. You scratch your ribs and make a mental note to check for lice again later. One of the risks of sleeping in your clothes is that you share everything. Heat, dirt, and parasites, with yourself continuously. You can't escape it. You're your own ecosystem. Then later in the day you pass someone airing their linens on a hedge, freshly washed shifts flapping in the breeze like medieval surrender flags. You wonder if theirs are softer. Probably not. Everyone's shirt feels like sandpaper after the third wash, especially if it's been boiled in lye soap and beaten on a rock. As night approaches again, you remove your tunic and sit by the hearth in your shift. The fire crackles, and the light plays off the worn fibres of your linen, casting soft shadows on the wall. You sip from a wooden cup, listening to the sound of the wind outside. It's quiet in the room, just the creak of beams and the occasional muttered prayer from the next bed over. You lie down on your straw mattress, pull the blanket up, and try to find a position where the lumpy stuffing doesn't jab you in the hip. You're still in the same shirt. You will be again tomorrow. But tonight, somehow, it feels different. Not clean exactly, but settled. The cloth against your skin carries the warmth of the fire, the smell of wood smoke, and just a hint of rosemary from the herbs someone threw into the laundry last week. It's not comfortable, not really, but it's familiar. It's enough. And as you drift off, scratchy and slightly damp, you wonder what it would be like to own a second shift, to change clothes before bed, to wrap yourself in something soft, fresh, and clean. But then again, that sounds suspiciously decadent. Morning begins with the hollow clang of a church bell echoing across the valley. No alarm clock, no rooster today. Just that single, solemn bong floating on the cool air like an ancient whisper saying, "You're already late." You stretch, bones popping, and stare up at the wooden beams above your head, trying to remember what day it is. It doesn't matter. The bell is ringing, and that means it's time to move. Because in the Middle Ages, time doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the church. You roll out of bed, your linen shift sticking to your back, and shuffle toward the open door. The light is soft, just starting to seep over the hills. In the centre of the village, a few figures are already walking toward the chapel, their forms hazy in the early fog. No one wears a watch. You don't know the exact hour, and no one expects you to. Time isn't measured in numbers here, it's measured in bells. Each day is broken into sections: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Monks and clergy pray through them, rising and kneeling and chanting at intervals that feel both precise and timeless. For regular folks like you, the bells mean more than just prayers. They mark when to wake, when to work, when to eat, and when to stop. Though, to be clear, Stopping is rare. Here's your historical time check. Mechanical clocks don't really show up until the late 13th and 14th centuries, and even then, they're mostly in cathedrals, monasteries, and rich cities that can afford an entire room dedicated to gears and bells. These early clocks don't even have faces. They're just machines that ring out the hours, echoing over rooftops to remind you that your life is ticking away whether you like it or not. In your village, the church bell is everything. It tolls for mass, for work, for funerals. It tolls when a baby is born, when someone dies, when the fields are on fire. You grow up recognizing the difference between one toll and three, between a slow, mournful peal and the sharp, frantic clanging of disaster. The bell is your weather app, your calendar, your emergency alert system. It's loud, it's reliable, and it never lets you sleep in. You head toward the field with a hoe over your shoulder, glancing at the sun's position. It's still low, early prime, maybe terse if you're late. Doesn't matter, you're behind. The rest of your work team is already in the barley rows digging and muttering. No one talks about time in hours. Instead, they say things like, before the next bell, or by mid-prayers. If someone tells you to meet them at third candle, you know they mean after dark when the third wax stub is burned down on the table. Crude, sure, but it works. The sun rises higher. You sweat. The wind picks up and drops again. Hours pass without names. You stop when the bell rings again, sexed. That's midday, more or less. You sit under a tree with your bit of bread and hard cheese, trying to calculate how long you'll have before you have to start working again. But there's no countdown, just instinct and rhythm. You eat, drink, and glance toward the chapel. You'll know it's time when the bell tells you it is. Here's your quirky time fact. Some people carried the time on their belts, sort of. There were portable sundials, small enough to be worn around the neck or carried in a pouch. Mostly for the rich, of course. They used the angle of the sun to estimate the hour, which only worked when the sun was out, which, let's be honest, isn't always the case. For everyone else, timekeeping was a matter of shadows, habits, and guesswork. Want to know when to milk the cow? Watch the light hit the edge of the barn door? Want to know when it's evening? Wait for the bats. But not everyone agrees how universal this time-by-bell rhythm really was. Scholars debate whether rural villages followed the monastic hours closely, or if they just worked from sun-up to sundown. Bells be damned. Some argue that bells were more symbolic outside monastic life, a general signal of change rather than a strict schedule. Others believe people were deeply attuned to the sound of the bell, using it to shape every task and prayer and bite of food. Honestly, both are probably true. Some people lived by the bell, others lived by the sun. Everyone lived by something they didn't control. By late afternoon, your arms ache and your legs feel like dry kindling. You glance at the sky again. The shadows are growing long. None will ring soon. Mid-afternoon prayers. You know because the swallows have started to appear, dipping through the air like it belongs to them. You gather your tools, wipe your face, and trudge back toward the village. The bell rings again, and your feet fall into pace with it without thinking. At home, the hearth is warm, the bread is cooling, and the light outside is dimming into something gentle. You don't check the time. You don't have a time. You just know it's evening. Vespers will come soon, the last bell before sleep. You listen for it in the distance, the long, slow tones that mark the end of the day like a sigh. You lie down on your straw mattress, still fully dressed, still sore, and let your breathing settle into the same rhythm the bells have been ringing all your life. No hours, no minutes, just sound, just the passing of moments marked by something older and heavier than your thoughts. And as you fall asleep, you hear one final soft toll, like a lullaby made of iron. You don't know what time it is, but you know it's time to rest. The bell said so. You wake up in a haze, mouth dry, head pulsing like a drum someone forgot to stop beating. Something's wrong. It's not just the usual stiffness or hunger or vague existential dread that greets most medieval mornings. This is different. You feel off, like the inside of your skull has been replaced with damp wool and regret. You try to sit up, but your vision swims. There's a dull ache behind your eyes and a sour taste on your tongue. Congratulations, you're sick. And in the Middle Ages, that's a real problem because medicine, if you can even call it that, is about to get weird. You groan, lie back down and brace yourself. Someone in your household is already lighting a candle and muttering a prayer. That's step one. Hope. Always start with divine intervention. You're sick because of something you did or thought or looked at too long. Or maybe the wind blew from the wrong direction. Maybe your humours are out of balance. Maybe a demon sneezed near your bed. Who knows? Either way, this is going to involve leeches. You hear them discussed in hushed tones before they even come into view. Someone says the word phlebotomy, which sounds clinical until you remember it means bloodletting. Basically opening your vein to release the bad stuff. Or if you're lucky, they just stick a few leeches behind your ears and let nature nibble at you while you stare at the ceiling and reflect on your life choices. Here's your historical fact to suck on. Bloodletting was a standard treatment for nearly every ailment during the Middle Ages. From headaches to fevers to toothaches to just feeling kind of sad on a Tuesday. Leech it out. The logic came from the ancient Greeks, especially Galen, whose writings on the four humours shaped medieval medicine. Too much blood? Out it goes. Not enough bile? Better find a way to fix that too. Spoiler. No one ever really knew what bile looked like, but that didn't stop anyone from trying to balance it. You manage to sit up barely, as a neighbour walks in holding a small jar. The leeches are real. They're alive. They're wiggling. You try not to scream. The neighbour is cheerful, suspiciously cheerful, as she explains how the leeches will bring your fever down and draw out the heat. One of them is named Henry. He's apparently very good at his job. You lie still as the first leech is applied to your wrist. It feels cold, then oddly firm, then it bites. The sensation is somewhere between a pinch and a slow, slurping insult. You stare at the ceiling and wonder how your life led you here. Probably that damp bread last night, or the night before, or maybe the turnips were cursed. You'll never know. Quirky fact for tonight's slow bleed. Leeches weren't just used in backwater huts. They were common in monasteries, noble households, and even by trained physicians, at least the ones who didn't also double as barbers. Barber surgeons, by the way, were exactly what they sound like. They cut your hair and your arm all in the same sitting. You could get a shave and a bloodletting in one visit, which is efficient, if wildly horrifying. Of course, not all treatments involve small vampires. Sometimes you're given a poultice, a goopy paste of herbs, honey, or clay smeared on the affected area, and held there with a rag that looks suspiciously like someone's old sock. Other times you're told to drink an infusion of wine mixed with garlic, vinegar, and whatever the apothecary had left that wasn't mouldy. The taste, like sadness with notes of rot. But maybe it'll work. Now for the open scholarly debate. Was medieval medicine completely useless? Some argue yes, it was more superstition than science, based on outdated ideas and blind guesses. Others point out that medieval practitioners understood more than we think. Herbal remedies were sometimes surprisingly effective. Midwives and folk healers used generations of practical knowledge, and yes, people did sometimes survive. Not because of leeches, but maybe in spite of them. You're not sure what's working in your case. The leeches are full and sluggish now, which apparently means you're getting better, or at least lighter. You feel dizzy but slightly cooler. Someone wraps your wrist and gives you a piece of dried apple as a treat. You chew it slowly, trying to avoid the part where your mouth tastes like iron and humiliation. Later in the day, a monk stops by with a little flask of something herbal. He offers a prayer, waves some incense around your bed, and hands you a tiny scroll of Latin scripture to tuck under your pillow. That's supposed to protect you while you sleep. From what? You're not entirely sure. Evil spirits, maybe. Or the mouse that's been chewing the bed leg. Either way, it's comforting. You drift in and out of sleep as the day fades, waking occasionally to the sound of someone stirring broth in the next room or whispering a prayer outside your door. You've had worse days. You're not dead. Yet. By nightfall, your fever has broken. Or maybe it hasn't, and you're just delirious. Either way, no more leeches today. The jar is gone. Henry has moved on. You're left with bandaged arms, a head full of fog, and the faint belief that something has been removed from you. Maybe your illness, maybe your pride. As you fall asleep, your hand curls around the little scroll under your pillow. Your body aches, your skin is cold, and your stomach is still undecided about that garlic wine. But you're alive, still breathing, still here, and in the Middle Ages, after a day like this, that's the best medicine of all. You wake to the soft drip-drip of water from the thatch above, and for once your head isn't pounding, your gut isn't twisting, and your blood isn't being actively harvested by leeches. A small win, really. But now there's something else to deal with. Your bladder. And like everything else in the Middle Ages, relieving yourself is an experience both oddly communal and deeply suspect. Today, you're going to discover the wild, unsettling world of medieval urine. Not just the act itself, though, yes, chamber pots are involved, but the fact that in this time, your pee is considered a diagnostic goldmine. You swing your legs off the bed, avoid the puddle from the leaky roof, and grab the chamber pot. It's tucked under your bed, where it's been quietly fermenting since sometime last night. You do your business with the resigned sigh of someone who knows there's no privacy in this world. You'll empty it later, probably into the communal pit or the roadside ditch unless someone needs it first. Because here's the truly medieval twist. Your urine isn't just waste, it's evidence, and someone's going to look at it. You carry the pot gingerly toward the back of the house where the local healer has set up shop. An old woman with more knowledge of herbs than any monk, and a reputation for diagnosing illness just by sniffing your bodily fluids. She's already waiting with a clean cup and a suspiciously enthusiastic grin. You hand over the pot. She pours. She squints at the colour, holds it up to the light, and gives it a swirl. Welcome to medieval uroscopy, the ancient art of diagnosing your problems based on what comes out of you. Here's your historical fact. Urine analysis was one of the most common and respected forms of diagnosis in the Middle Ages. Physicians, and those pretending to be physicians, used charts with colour guides to interpret everything from yellow gold to cloudy brown. The colour, consistency, smell, even the presence of bubbles or sediment could supposedly tell them what was wrong with your body. Fever, yellow and frothy. Stomach problems, murky with flakes, demonic possession. Let's just say you probably weren't getting a second opinion. The healer taps her finger against the side of the cup and hums. She asks what you've eaten, if your bowels are moving, if you've recently been bitten by anything strange. You nod and mumble something about bread and goat's milk. She sniffs again. You stare at the ceiling and try not to think about the fact that your health has come down to someone else's interpretation of pea notes. Quirky fact time. Medieval physicians sometimes carried around special flasks just for urine, matulae, often made of glass so they could get a clear look at the sample. These flasks were symbols of their profession. There are even paintings and woodcuts of serious-looking men holding up glass vessels filled with golden liquid, gazing at them as if unlocking the secrets of the universe. It was a vibe. You've seen one of these guys before. Once, when a nobleman passed through your village and his physician unpacked a velvet-lined box filled with flasks. He spent hours swirling and sniffing while muttering about humours. He was wearing a hat shaped like a small loaf of bread, and everyone was too afraid to question it. He looked important, so he must have been right. The scholarly debate here is whether uroscopy was ever truly effective or just medieval performance art. Some argue that keen observation of urine could reveal infections or dehydration. Others insist it was mostly guesswork dressed in Latin, with practitioners inventing connections between cloudy pee and melancholy spirits. What's certain is that people believed in it, deeply. They trusted their healers to read the signs, even if those signs came from the least glamorous part of the human body. You, however, are not convinced. You watch the healer hand the cup back and announce your diagnosis. Too much heat in the stomach. Your bile is angry. She gives you a little pouch of dried herbs, mostly chamomile, maybe some mint, and tells you to steep it in warm water. Avoid cheese, she adds, with deadly seriousness. It fuels the fire. You nod solemnly, as if cheese has personally wronged you, and make your way back home with the pouch. You brew the herbs, sip the bitter liquid, and try to avoid thinking about the fact that someone else started their day sniffing your bodily output. In a way, it's humbling, or horrifying, or both. By mid-afternoon, you feel marginally better. Maybe it's the herbs. Maybe it's the placebo effect. Maybe you are just dehydrated and sleep-deprived and possibly cursed. Either way, you're upright and not leaking from any major orifices, which is all you can really ask for in this life. As you go about your chores, you find yourself watching the stream in the village more closely. You wonder how much of what's floating in it could be used for diagnosis. The thought lingers unpleasantly, so you redirect to something more pleasant, like the smell of fresh bread or the slight warmth of the sun on your arms. Life, after all, is full of tiny joys between indignities. That night, as you empty your chamber pot in the back alley and rinse it with half a cup of stale ale, because water is for fools, you glance up at the stars. Somewhere someone is still awake, holding a flask of cloudy liquid up to a candle and pretending they know what it means. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. All you know is that your body's quiet, your stomach is still, and you're not being bled again. You crawl into bed, shift rustling, and close your eyes with a sigh. You've survived another day of medieval healthcare. And tomorrow, if your humours behave, you might even get some cheese. You wake slowly, cocooned in the slightly damp comfort of your linen shift and the scratchy embrace of your straw-stuffed bedding. For a moment you just lie there, staring at the dark ceiling beams and listening to the faint morning sounds. Footsteps outside, a creaky wheelbarrow, a goat yelling something urgent in the distance, and then it hits you. That dull, throbbing ache in your jaw. You poke it with your tongue. Yep, toothache. Again. And in the Middle Ages, a sore tooth isn't just an inconvenience, it's a trial by fire. You shuffle toward the fire, hoping the warm air will distract your nerves. It doesn't. The pain pulses steadily. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't even think. Your molar feels like it's harbouring a tiny demon with a pickaxe, and your options? Limited. No Novocaine, no root canal, no numbing gel with a pleasant cherry flavour. Instead, you're looking at a short menu of 1. Herbal poultices, 2. Holy relics, or 3. Pulling the cursed thing out with whatever rusty, vaguely hook-shaped tool is lying around. You sit down and press a warm cloth to your jaw while your neighbour rummages through her basket. She's the village herbalist. Or she says she is. Either way, she hands you a wad of linen soaked in garlic juice and vinegar, wrapped around a piece of crushed sage. You're supposed to bite it. You do. It tastes like a salad gone terribly wrong, and burns like someone poured fire directly onto your gums. But for a fleeting moment, the pain dulls. Maybe from the herbs, maybe from the shock. You'll take it. Here's your historical fact to chew on, very gently. Dental care in the Middle Ages was a strange mix of surprisingly practical remedies and wildly desperate measures. People knew some herbs helped with pain. Clove oil, garlic, onion poultices, and even mint were common. But when things got serious, teeth were often just yanked out, and not gently. The tooth key, an iron instrument shaped like a twisted wrench, was designed to hook around the tooth and twist it free, frequently taking part of your jaw with it. Dentistry, more like controlled demolition. You hear rumours that monks in the monastery down the road are better at it. They have tools, and prayers, and steady hands. But they also believe that pain is cleansing, that suffering purifies the soul. So yes, they might help, but only after they chant over your face and make you feel like the toothache is divine punishment. You decide to wait. Maybe the pain will fade. You go about your day, trying to ignore it, trying to focus on anything else. But every bite of bread is agony. Every sip of ale feels like it's splashing onto an open wound. You think about using wax to cover the tooth, like the nobles do sometimes. A tiny plug to keep the air out. But you don't have wax. Just a bit of tallow and yesterday's porridge. Not ideal dental materials. Quirky fact of the night. Some people believe toothaches were caused by toothworms, tiny creatures that burrowed into your molars and caused pain by wiggling around in there. This theory wasn't entirely medieval either. It persisted in various cultures for centuries. Some treatments even claimed to smoke the worm out using heated herbs or burning oil. If you felt something pop or crack, that was the worm fleeing, or your tooth cracking. Hard to say. And here's the scholarly debate still buzzing around. How widespread was dental decay in the Middle Ages? Some studies of skeletal remains suggest that many people actually had pretty decent teeth, especially compared to later centuries. Less sugar in the diet, more coarse grains, and a lot of chewing meant teeth wore down but didn't necessarily rot. Others point to evidence of abscesses, broken teeth, and signs of infection that would have made daily life miserable. The truth? It probably varied wildly, like everything else. Some people made it to old age with a mouthful of grinders, others were gumming soup by 30. You spend the evening hunched by the hearth, pressing a warm stone to your jaw and trying not to snap at anyone. The pain flares unpredictably. You think about pulling it yourself. You've seen someone do it. Tie a string around the tooth and the other end to a door, then slam. That person was never quite the same afterward. You decide to give it another day. Say it! Eventually the cloth poultice starts to take the edge off again. Or maybe your brain is just tired of feeling things. You lie down and cover your face with a corner of your blanket, curling up and wishing you had a proper pillow or a small miracle. You whisper a prayer, not to any particular saint, but to whoever might be on shift tonight in the divine dental department. Somewhere outside, the night insects hum and the wind whistles through the trees. You drift in and out, half asleep, dreaming of soft bread and warm broth, and a mouth that doesn't feel like it's on fire. You're still sore, but you're not bleeding. The tooth is still in there, for now. Tomorrow might be the day it comes out, or it might be another day of garlic and vinegar and chanting. But tonight you've survived. You lived through a medieval toothache without losing your mind, or your molar, and in this world that's basically a win. You wake groggy, your jaw still throbbing from yesterday's dental apocalypse, but at least you're not being dragged to a monastery for emergency tooth removal. Small victories. The fire's low, your limbs are stiff and someone's banging on the door. 3 short knocks and a pause. That's not a friendly visit. That's plague news. You sit up slowly, heart sinking. You've heard whispers all week. Someone's coughing in the next village. Someone else buried 2 kids before sunrise. And now the bell's tolling in that ominous way that means someone's gone. Again. Welcome to the darkest chapter in the medieval handbook, the Plague Years. You open the door to find a messenger from the manor house, wrapped in a cloak and covering his mouth with a bit of linen soaked in vinegar. He doesn't step inside. He just tells you that the neighbouring parish is closing its roads. No one in or out, which means it's close now. Closer than comfortable. You thank him and shut the door gently, trying not to think about how many people you passed in the last few days. Who you touched. Who touched you. You sit by the hearth and watch the fire, suddenly very aware of every little tickle in your throat, every ache in your muscles. Was that cough normal? Or is it starting? That's how it begins. Fever, chills, nausea, and then the telltale swellings, buboes. Large, painful lumps, usually in the groin or armpits, that grow and darken until you know for sure you're not getting better. After that, it's a race between your immune system and your odds of being buried before anyone notices. Historical fact to rattle your bones. The Black Death tore through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. Entire villages were wiped out. In some places there were too many dead to bury, and bodies were tossed into mass graves or burned. People who had known nothing but routine, bells, barley and badly made shoes, suddenly faced a horror that moved faster than gossip. And in a society that didn't know about bacteria or viruses, everyone looked for meaning where there was none. You venture outside cautiously. The market is almost empty. People speak in whispers. Faces are half covered. No one lingers. You see a cart creaking past with a blanket over something far too still. A dog follows behind, tail low. You try not to look. And here comes the most iconic and unnerving figure of the time, the plague doctor. He's wearing a long dark robe, gloves, boots, and that mask, shaped like a beak, with glass lenses for eyes and a long curved nose packed with aromatic herbs, lavender, mint, maybe dried roses. It's meant to protect him from the bad air, the miasma that was believed to carry disease. He walks slowly, deliberately, more like an omen than a man. You step aside and feel your skin crawl as he passes. Quirky plague era detail. Those masks weren't just creepy, they were practical in their own weird way. The herbs helped mask the smell of death. The beak kept distance between doctor and patient. Some even carried canes to poke or lift clothing without touching the infected, and yet these doctors were rarely trained. Often they were volunteers, or people with just enough nerve to charge the dying a fee. Their survival rate wasn't great, but they looked terrifying enough to be remembered. There's a scholarly debate that still itches at the edges of history. What actually helped during the plague? Some argue quarantine efforts worked, despite being based more on desperation than science. Others believe that moving to the countryside, staying isolated and just getting very lucky were the only reliable strategies. Medical advice at the time ranged from burn aromatic herbs to pray harder, to don't bathe, it opens your pores. There were bloodlettings, flagellants marching through the streets whipping themselves and priests blessing vinegar-soaked coins. The real answer? None of it really worked. Except, maybe, shutting the doors and waiting it out. You retreat home, sealing the door with a heavy bar. You light a bundle of sage, not because you think it'll help, but because it smells better than fear. You hang a sprig of rosemary above the window. You wash your hands, rare but suddenly not unheard of, and mutter a prayer to St. Sebastian, the go-to plague guy. You also say one to St. Roch, just in case. Can't hurt. You try to eat, but your stomach's clenched. So you sip broth and stare into the fire, listening for footsteps outside. Any knock now feels like a death sentence. You think about your neighbours, about who might already be gone and who might be next. This isn't like winter, or famine, or toothaches. This is different. This is now. And yet, despite the terror, you carry on. Because what else can you do? You wash your linen shift, air it out. You sleep farther from the others, just in case. You keep your knife nearby, not for protection from people, but from the panic clawing at your thoughts. As night falls, you lie awake, every creak and cough in the house amplified by dread. You think of the bell, the way it rang this morning, the way it will ring again tomorrow, and you wonder, will it toll for you? But eventually sleep takes you, not because you feel safe, but because fear is exhausting, and in the darkness, with the scent of herbs and smoke hanging in the air, you hope that when the sun rises, your breath will still come easy, that your skin will still be whole, that the shadow will pass you by. For tonight, at least, you are alive. You wake slowly, the way someone does when they're not entirely sure what kind of world they're waking up to. The room is quiet, too quiet. No footsteps, no banging buckets, no muttered prayers. The fire's gone cold, the air is heavy. You sit up, your joints stiff, every sound feeling too loud. You're not dead, you're also not quite well, but you're still here. Which these days is worth something. You pull on your tunic, the wool scratchy against your skin, and make your way outside. And today, for the first time in weeks, you're not sick, you're not mourning, you're not quarantined, you're injured. You managed to trip on your own shoe and twist your ankle, because of course you did. And now, you get the rare and thrilling experience of being treated by a medieval hospital. Well, hospital is a generous term. You hobble toward the edge of the village where the small stone building sits, flanked by a herb garden and a wooden cross. This isn't a hospital in the modern sense. It's more like a holy shelter, a place for the poor, the sick, the dying, and the hopelessly inconvenient. You're greeted by a monk wearing a brown habit, and an expression that reads equal parts compassion and "don't make me touch you." He ushers you inside with a nod, and gestures toward a bench next to an old woman who might be asleep or quietly ascending to sainthood. Here's your historical fact for today's bedside reading. Medieval hospitals were primarily run by religious orders. Monasteries provided the space, the staff, and the general philosophy. Caring for the sick was a Christian duty. These places weren't about healing, really. They were about comfort. You came here to be cared for, fed, prayed over, and if necessary, gently escorted to the afterlife. Recovery was more of a bonus than an expectation. You sit on the bench and watch as a nun approaches with a jug of water and a bundle of rags. She asks you what happened. You explain the shoe incident, and she nods like this is both common and spiritually significant. She unwraps the rags, cleanish, and begins soaking them in what smells like lavender and vinegar. You resist the urge to yank your leg back as she dabs your swollen ankle with the mixture. It stings. A lot. She murmurs something about inflammation and excess heat in the limb and tucks a sprig of rosemary into the binding. You wonder if that's for healing or for scent, because your foot does smell like regret. You glance around the room. There are about 6 other people here. One is coughing violently into a cloth. Another stares at the wall, lips moving silently. A third is missing part of his hand and watching the nun work like she's about to perform a miracle. There's no privacy, just a few curtains, if that. The floors are swept clean, though, and a row of herbs hangs from the rafters. Sage, thyme, comfrey, maybe even poppy if someone got lucky. Now for your quirky medical footnote. In some hospitals, music was played for the patients, not for entertainment, but because it was believed to soothe the soul and encourage healing. Psalms, chants, and gentle harp music could be heard echoing through stone halls, mingling with the smell of soup and sweat. Healing, after all, was considered a holistic experience, which meant body, mind, and soul, all tended to with equal amounts of honey water and Latin. The nun wraps your foot tightly, says something about resting it for 3 days, and hands you a wooden spoon. "Soup's coming," she says. "Lentils." You're not sure if that's a blessing or a threat, but at this point you'll take anything that doesn't involve leeches or amputation. Here's where the scholarly debate creeps in like a draft under the door. How effective were medieval hospitals, really? Some argue that these institutions were more about spiritual care than actual medicine, that monks and nuns offered prayers more often than cures. Others believe that for their time they were surprisingly advanced, clean, organised, and focused on patient comfort, in a way that wouldn't return until centuries later. No one agrees entirely, but most concede that given the era's limitations, these places were doing the best they could with what they had. which, in your case, is vinegar wraps and divine optimism. Later that afternoon, someone offers you a small cushion for your foot, a folded up bit of linen filled with straw and herbs. You thank them. You shift on the bench. You listen to a distant chant drifting in from the chapel next door. The rhythm is soothing, and you find yourself tapping your fingers along with the beat. Maybe the music does help, or maybe you're just too tired to fight the calm. You're not in agony, you're not dying. Your foot hurts, sure, but you're sitting in a warm building eating lentils, being tended to by people who haven't charged you a single coin. That's more kindness than some people get all year. You think of the crowded houses outside, the labourers still pushing carts, the shepherd with the limp who never stopped walking. For now, you're here, off your feet, safe. And in the Middle Ages, safe is a relative but deeply treasured state. As night falls, a candle is lit beside your bench, and the nun tucks a blanket around your shoulders. You mumble a thank you, suddenly sleepy. She nods and walks away, her habit swishing softly across the stone floor. You breathe in the scent of thyme, bread, and wax. Your ankle still throbs, but gently now, like a warning that's been heard and noted. You close your eyes. You're in a hospital, technically, and you're healing, slowly, humbly, and with more herbs than you know what to do with. And if the only music tonight is the quiet hum of monks at prayer, then let it be your lullaby. You wake up stiff, sore, and slightly confused by the smell of thyme still clinging to your blanket. The nun gave you another poultice sometime during the night, and now your ankle feels like it's been baked inside a soup. But hey, you can stand. Kind of. That means it's time to go home, or at least back to real life, where rest isn't an option, and injury is just something to walk off. You nod your thanks to the monk sweeping the floor, gather your things, by which you mean your shoes and a spoon, and limp your way back toward town. The church bells are ringing in the distance, which tells you it's already late morning, and today, as you'll soon remember with a groan, is market day. Market day is a full-contact sport. You approach the town square and it's already chaos. Carts creaking under sacks of grain, children darting underfoot, pigs squealing like they're making political statements. You find yourself dodging a goose that may or may not have a vendetta against your family. Somewhere to your left, someone drops a bundle of onions, and someone else immediately starts arguing over who has the legal right to pick them up. You're here on a mission. Not to shop exactly, but to help a friend sell their goods, which means standing, smiling, poorly, and pretending you know the difference between slightly wilted turnips and criminally wilted turnips. You set up your little stall under a fraying canopy and do your best to look competent. Spoiler, you are not. Within minutes, you've dropped a basket, miscounted someone's change, and accidentally insulted a woman's cabbage. Things are going well. Still, market days are the heartbeat of the medieval town. They're loud, messy, and overflowing with life, and you wouldn't trade them for anything. They're where you hear news from other villages, where merchants bring in exotic goods like dried figs and strange cloth, and where you learn more about human behaviour than you ever wanted to. You've seen people bargain over nails like they were precious gems. You've seen a grown man cry over a slightly bruised apple. You've also seen 3 fights break out over whose chicken laid an egg first. Here's your historical fact for today's open-air excursion. Medieval markets were tightly regulated. Towns were granted market charters by the king or lord, giving them the right to hold markets on specific days. These charters were gold. Without one, you couldn't legally gather to trade goods, and unauthorised merchants could be fined or worse. Officials called alewoods, breadweighers, and market reeves patrolled the square, checking the quality of goods, enforcing prices, and generally making sure no one was trying to sell rocks as root vegetables. You wave down a passing merchant and ask him about the spice prices. Just out of curiosity, you tell yourself. He lifts a pouch dramatically, pulls out a pinch of something reddish gold and lets you sniff. Saffron. One whiff and your purse already feels poorer. He names a price that would buy you a goat and a new pair of shoes, and you laugh politely before limping away. Then there's the meat vendor, a man with arms like barrels and a questionable attitude toward food safety. You watch as he slaps a hunk of salted pork onto a slab of wood that definitely hasn't been washed since the last plague wave. Still, people buy it. They always do. You don't question it too hard. You've eaten worse things, probably yesterday. Now for your fringe fact, in some towns, women could actually dominate parts of the marketplace, especially in food trade. Alewives, fishwives, bakers, and cheesemongers often ran their own stalls. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave them economic power, which, surprise, made a lot of men very nervous. Accusations of cheating, gossiping, or witchcraft often followed successful market women like unpaid apprentices. The scholarly debate around market economics in the Middle Ages is one that still makes people squint at parchments and sigh deeply in archives. Some argue the markets were genuinely competitive and somewhat fair, while others believe they were completely rigged, favouring locals, guild members, or anyone who could bribe the reeve. What's clear is that markets were a crucial space where village life collided with money, authority, and just enough drama to make you forget how badly your feet hurt. Back at your stall, you're down to 2 bruised apples and 1 squash that looks like it's plotting something. You manage to trade the lot for a loaf of barley bread and a small bit of smoked cheese. You're about to celebrate when a customer asks if you're free for a little extra work. You squint. Extra work is medieval code for anything from hauling manure to retrieving a cat from a thatched roof. This time, it's something better. Helping unload a spice cart. Your ankle protests, but your stomach reminds you that smoked cheese is not dinner. You follow the man down an alley to a shaded corner where a covered cart sits guarded by a boy with a stick, and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen too much cinnamon. You lift sacks, try not to sneeze, and get paid with a handful of dried figs. Worth it. By the time you limp home, the sun is sinking. Your hands smell like onions, pork, and something faintly gingery. You're bruised, exhausted, and still unsure whether that goose ever forgave you. But you've eaten today. You've earned something with your back and your breath. You even got to sniff saffron, which counts as a luxury experience. You collapse onto your straw mattress, the scent of spices still lingering in your sleeves. The marketplace buzzes in your memory. Colour, noise, laughter, lies. Tomorrow it'll be quieter. But for today, you were part of the chaos. And in the Middle Ages, that means you lived. You wake with the scent of yesterday's market still trapped in your nose. Onion, sweat, crushed herbs, and just a ghost of roasted meat. Your body aches in ways you didn't know it could, especially your ankle, which has taken your decision to work a spice cart personally. Still, you made it through, and today your only job is to help fetch water. Easy, right? You smile to yourself. It's adorable how little you know, because today's adventure is going to take you deep into one of the most underappreciated nightmares of the medieval world: water management. You sling 2 empty wooden buckets across a yoke and set out toward the village well. The morning is cool, the sky a soft, washed-out blue, and the air smells faintly of mud and smoke. Birds chirp, someone yells at a donkey, and a dog tries to steal a shoe. Just another quiet start. The problem is that water doesn't come from a tap. There are no pipes in your wall, no plumbing snaking under the floor. If you want water, you go to it. And depending on how clean you want it, or how desperate you are, you have options. First stop, the main well. It's halfway across town in a little stone circle surrounded by moss and gossip. There's already a small line, mostly women balancing yokes like yours and a few grumbling boys sent on chore duty. You nod at someone you know and wait your turn. The pulley creaks as someone draws a full bucket, heavy and dripping. The stone lip of the well is worn smooth from decades of hands and ropes and splashes. This is your cleanest option, or let's say, your least dangerous. Here's your historical fact to sip on. Access to clean water in the Middle Ages varied wildly by location and status. Some towns had relatively clean wells, or even public fountains fed by spring-fed aqueducts, especially in wealthier areas or old Roman cities where infrastructure hadn't completely collapsed. But for most people, water came from wells, rivers, or rain barrels, and each had its own risks. Wells could be contaminated by nearby latrines, dead animals, or just bad luck. Rivers were open invitations for upstream waste, and barrels. Let's just say if you saw something moving in it, you skimmed it off and pretended you didn't. You fill your buckets. The wood swells slightly as it absorbs the water, and your arms instantly protest. You balance the yoke across your shoulders, teeth clenched, and start the slow, awkward walk home. The water sloshes with every step. 1 foot too fast and you'll lose half of it. 2 feet too slow and you'll never make it before lunch. Along the way you pass the laundry pit, essentially a shallow basin fed by the stream. Several women are already there, sleeves rolled, hands raw from scrubbing. Soapwort, ash soap and elbow grease. It's a scene of domestic war. They nod at you as you pass, and one asks if your shift ever came clean from last week's goat incident. You laugh. Sort of. It didn't. Quirky fact time, people didn't actually drink much water straight, especially in cities. It was too risky. Instead, they drank ale, low-alcohol small beer, brewed to be safer than the stuff in the stream. Even children drank it. It wasn't for getting drunk, it was for not dying. Wine played a similar role for the upper classes, often diluted with water, which defeats the point if your water's already sketchy, but logic wasn't always invited to these conversations. Boiling water for tea or broth helped, but not everyone had the fuel, or the time. You stagger home and pour the buckets into a large ceramic basin. That's for cooking and washing, and hopefully not confusing the two. You've lost at least a quarter of the haul just walking it back. Your shoulder burns, your back hates you, and you've got to do it all again before sunset. There's some debate among historians about how bad medieval water really was. Some evidence suggests people were aware of contamination. They built wells carefully, kept livestock downstream, and even passed laws about where latrines could go. But others point out the frequent outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid and cholera, and say, plainly, that people were often just desperate and unaware. Disease moved invisibly, and unless you were very lucky or very rich, you learned the danger too late. Later that afternoon you're sent to fetch water again, this time for the animals. You don't bother with the well. You go to the stream. It's low and muddy this time of year, and the banks are littered with hoof prints. You dip the bucket and try not to look at what's floating past. Something that was once alive is now swirling downstream with impressive dignity. You scoop quickly and walk away. Back home, the water goes into a trough. The animals slurp it without a care. You envy them. You sit on the ground, back against the fence, and sip your small ale. It tastes flat, slightly sour, and better than any water you've had all day. As evening settles in, you help pour some of the clean water into a small pot and place it over the fire. Tonight there'll be stew. The vegetables are tired. The broth will be thin, but it's warm, and you carried it here. That counts for something. You wash your hands, rare, luxurious, and wipe them on a towel that's seen better centuries. Then you lie back on your mat and let your body sink into the quiet ache of a job done. Not well, not efficiently, but done. And in this world, where clean water is a miracle and every full bucket is a victory, you fall asleep knowing you earned every drop. You wake to rain tapping gently against the thatched roof, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby that showed up late to the party. For once, the world outside feels hushed, like even the roosters are giving you a moment to breathe. It's going to be a slow day, a wet day, a day where fields flood, roads turn to soup, and outdoor chores are politely cancelled by nature itself. But even rain can't cancel everything, because today you've been volunteered, without consent of course, to help make soap. Yes, soap. That rare and glorious substance that promises cleanliness but arrives via fire, stench, and a splash of potential skin damage. You roll out of bed, already regretting everything. The rain's made the air cold and damp, and the floor feels like stepping on a dead fish. You pull on your stiff wool tunic, which still smells faintly of goat, and head out to meet the neighbours who are assembling near the large iron cauldron like they're about to summon something unholy. And in a way, they are. Soap in the medieval world is not a bar of something sweet that leaves you smelling like lavender and hope. It's a hard-won, labour-intensive mixture of fat and lye, a substance so caustic it might as well come with a warning from Satan himself. The fat comes from animals, usually left over from cooking or butchering. The lye comes from ashes soaked in water. Together, they create something that can scrub filth off your tunic, your hands, and probably your soul. Here's your historical fact for this scalding little adventure. Medieval soap was a real thing, used more often for laundry than for personal hygiene. It was made from rendered animal fats, like beef or mutton tallow, and wood ash, forming a rough, sometimes grainy paste or hard cake. Soap was known across Europe, but quality and usage varied. In places like Castile, Spain, olive oil-based soap became famous for being higher end. In Northern Europe, you used what you had, and what you had was usually pig fat and sorrow. You help gather wood for the fire, then assist in rendering the fat. This means melting it down into a thick, greasy liquid while trying not to breathe through your nose. The smell is indescribable, somewhere between burned meat, wet dog, and despair. You stir slowly with a long wooden paddle, praying that none of it splashes on your clothes, or your skin, or your immortal soul. Next comes the lye. A wooden barrel has been set aside for this, the bottom lined with straw, the top packed with ashes from the hearth. Water is poured over it and left to drip down, drawing out the alkaline goodness. The result is a pale, vicious liquid that looks innocent but can dissolve your skin if it's feeling moody. You mix it with the melted fat in the cauldron, stirring until it starts to thicken. This is not the elegant chemistry of later centuries. There are no precise measurements, no thermometers, no lovely moulds shaped like flowers. It's a bubbling, seething, greyish mess that may or may not work, depending on the weather, the ash, and your collective faith. You stir for what feels like an eternity, arms aching, hands blistering from the steam. The others talk and joke, clearly used to the process. You, on the other hand, keep checking your hands for signs of imminent melting. Here's your fringe fact. Some medieval people believed that too much cleanliness was dangerous. Yes, dangerous. Bathing too often was thought to weaken the body's natural defences or open the pores to disease. So while soap was made, it wasn't necessarily used for scrubbing your armpits every day. More likely it was for your clothes, or your tools, or your hair maybe, if you were feeling fancy and didn't mind the lye taking a few scalp cells with it. Of course, there's scholarly debate here too. Some historians argue that medieval hygiene wasn't as bad as pop culture makes it seem. There's evidence of regular washing, bathhouses in many towns, and people who clearly cared about how they smelled. But others point out that for the average peasant, daily bathing wasn't realistic. Water was scarce, hot water even more so, and soap wasn't something you used lightly. You didn't lather, you rationed. By mid-afternoon, the soap mixture is cooling in wooden troughs lined with cloth. It will harden overnight, then be cut into rough chunks and stored. Some will be traded, some used for laundry. Maybe, if you're lucky, you'll get a bit to keep in your own home, though you'll probably just end up giving it to your mother or neighbour in exchange for bread. Your tunic smells terrible, your arms are raw from the steam, but you've made soap. Not the pretty kind, not the kind with swirls and essential oils, but the real stuff, the stuff that scrapes grime out of your socks and scrubs pots clean. You watch the steam rise from the trough and feel something like pride. That evening you soak your feet in a warm basin, adding a few shavings from a leftover lump of soap. It bites into the dirt like nothing else. You lean back, eyes closed, and for the first time in days feel almost clean. Not perfume clean, not spade clean, but functional, presentable, peasant clean. You crawl into bed with your fingers still smelling faintly of ashes and fat. Not pleasant, but comforting in its own strange way. You made something today, something useful, something harsh and necessary, just like this world. And as you drift off, you wonder what it might be like to smell like roses, or almonds, or anything that wasn't a former pig. But then again, you'd probably be accused of witchcraft. You wake with your hands still stiff from yesterday's soap-making escapade. There's a subtle ache in your wrists, like your body is sending a polite but pointed message. Please don't do that again, but there's no time to listen. Because today isn't about chores or markets or even brewing questionable lye concoctions. Today, it's all about food. Making it, preserving it, and not dying from eating it. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, where recipes are optional, spices are expensive, and dinner is basically a gamble with your digestive system. You're assigned to help in the kitchen of a nearby manor, which sounds more glamorous than it is. You arrive before dawn, slipping through a smoky side door into a space filled with clatter and shouting. Fires roar, pots boil, and 2 chickens are running in circles, one of which should not be running. A harried cook with flour in his beard yells for you to stir the pottage and don't let it burn this time. You nod, grab a long wooden spoon and peer into the massive cauldron. Pottage is the catch-all stew of the medieval world. Half soup, half sludge, and always changing depending on what's available. Today's version includes barley, cabbage, leeks, garlic, and a suspicious root someone swears is edible. You stir carefully, trying not to splash the bubbling surface. Every now and then, the cook tosses in a scrap of meat or a dried herb, muttering like a wizard casting lunch-based spells. Historical fact for your menu today. The medieval diet for common folk was heavy on grains and vegetables, light on meat, and absolutely smothered in repetition. Bread, pottage, and ale were staples, eaten daily, sometimes 3 times a day, sometimes cold, sometimes not entirely fresh. Fresh meat was a rarity. Salted, smoked, or dried meats were more common, and even those weren't everyday fare unless you lived near a generous pig. Dairy showed up in the form of cheese and butter, but again, only if you had access to a cow or goat and weren't currently selling every drop to pay rent. You get handed a sack of turnips and a dull knife. Your job, peel and chop without slicing off any parts of yourself. You comply, working carefully, listening to the conversation around you. Someone's gossiping about a wedding feast 2 villages over. They had actual venison, the woman says, eyes wide, and spiced wine. No one even died from it. You nod along as if you've tasted spiced wine before, which you haven't. Unless you count the time someone dropped a clove into a mug of cider and called it exotic. Over in the corner, someone is grinding grain for bread, not fluffy, golden-crusted loaves. We're talking dense, dark rounds that could double as weapons in a tavern brawl. The flour's coarse, flecked with chaff and occasionally a pebble or two. You learn to chew carefully in this world. Dental care, as you've noticed, is more reactive than preventative. Time for a quirky kitchen tidbit. Many homes kept kitchen gardens, small plots filled with herbs, greens, onions and beans. These were vital for flavour and nutrition. But the truly wild ingredient? Hedgehogs. Yes, hedgehogs were occasionally eaten, especially by poorer folk in the countryside, skinned, cleaned and baked in clay. Once the clay hardened and cracked, the spines would peel off with it. You glance nervously toward the meat bench just in case. By midday, the kitchen air is thick with smoke and sweat. You wipe your brow with a cloth that smells vaguely of leek, then help ladle out pottage into bowls. This manner feeds its workers, something not all do. And though the food is simple, it's hot, filling, and doesn't scream poison at first glance. You sit on a stool outside with your bowl, eating slowly, savouring the garlic and the soft, buttery barley. Now let's stir in a scholarly debate. How well fed were people in the Middle Ages? Some historians argue that peasants had a surprisingly balanced diet, rich in fibre and plant-based nutrients, with lower rates of obesity and heart disease than modern folks. Others counter that malnutrition was rampant, especially during famines, long winters, or times of war. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. If the harvest was good, if disease didn't strike, and if your lord wasn't a complete monster, you could survive, maybe even thrive. But one bad year could turn stew into starvation. After lunch, you're sent to the back storeroom to help with preservation. This is where food becomes science, or witchcraft, or something in between. Meats hang from hooks, cured with salt or smoked over weeks. Jars of pickled vegetables line the shelves. There's even a barrel of sauerkraut, sharp and sour-smelling, but effective. In a world without refrigeration, preservation is everything. You don't just eat what's in season. You plan for winter like it's trying to kill you, because it is. You help pack salt around a cut of pork, rubbing it in like it insulted your family. Then you help seal jars of beans with beeswax and hang bunches of herbs to dry from the rafters. It's methodical, repetitive work, but there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing this food will be here weeks from now, when snow covers the fields and the turnips are more ice than vegetable. Evening arrives with a bang, literally, as someone drops a pot and everyone swears in chorus. You help clean up, wash your hands in a basin of cloudy water, and are given a small loaf to take home. "Thanks for not ruining the pottage," the cook says gruffly, which is as close to praise as you're going to get. You walk home in the fading light, bread under your arm, stomach full, smoke still clinging to your clothes. Your hands ache, your feet are tired, but your belly is warm. And as you crawl into bed, pulling the blanket up to your chin, you wonder what tomorrow's meal might be. Pottage again, probably. Maybe with a little cheese, or a beet, or, if the gods are smiling, a scrap of meat that doesn't fight back. You close your eyes and drift off with the scent of barley and garlic still in your hair. In a world where food means survival, every bowl is a victory. You wake slowly, stomach rumbling, breath misting in the cold air. The coals in the hearth are nearly out, and your blanket, which never smelled great to begin with, now carries the faint aroma of garlic, smoke and fatigue. You roll onto your side and groan. You've lived through plague rumours, open-air dentistry, chamber pots, soap-making, and goat-related humiliation. And now, with sore hands and half a loaf of bread to your name, you get to experience something truly thrilling, a medieval feast. Not yours, obviously. You haven't suddenly become nobility overnight. But a noble family in the next manor over is throwing a celebration, a wedding, or maybe a treaty signing, or just one of those elaborate excuses to show off their food and their wealth while everyone else gnaws on bark. And lucky you, you've been conscripted into the service crew. You arrive at the manor early before the sun has cleared the low hills, and are immediately swept up into a world that feels utterly foreign. The stone hall is massive, with banners hanging from wooden beams and long tables lined with carved benches. Fireplaces at either end roar with heat, and already servants are racing back and forth with jugs, knives, baskets and bowls. You're handed a lumpy tunic, brown of course, and told to stand straight and don't drop anything important. You nod, eyes wide, trying not to trip over your own excitement. This is not your village pottage and turnip lifestyle. This is theatre. You're ushered into the kitchen where the smell hits you like a horse cart. Meat roasting, onions sizzling, spices crackling in pans. Someone's basting an entire pig with honey. Someone else is carving pears into flower shapes. It's like you've stepped into a dream, or possibly a hallucination brought on by eating undercooked beans. Here's your historical fact for this last course. Noble feasts in the Middle Ages were elaborate affairs designed to dazzle, impress, and remind everyone exactly who was in charge. The meals could last hours and include dozens of courses. Rich meats like venison, boar, swan, or even peacock were common, often dressed back up in their own feathers for presentation. Sauces were thick with cinnamon, cloves, saffron and pepper, all absurdly expensive. The bread, white, soft and absolutely not for peasants. The wine flowed, the minstrels played, and the leftovers, usually tossed or given to the dogs, just to remind everyone where they stood. You're stationed near the great table, assigned to serve trenchers. Thick slices of stale bread used as edible plates. Each guest gets one. After the meal, if they don't eat it, it's given to the poor or, more often, thrown out. You hand out the trenchers carefully, palms sweating. A knight with too many rings grunts as you place his in front of him. You don't make eye contact. Then the courses begin. Platters of roasted birds arrive, each glazed and golden. Bowls of stewed fruits and sweetened vegetables follow. There's a pie, an actual pie, that oozes spiced meat and raisins. You blink. Raisins in meat. You're not sure whether to be impressed or deeply offended. A servant carries in a peacock, tail feathers fanned, its beak painted gold. You can't tell if you're supposed to eat it or worship it. Your job is simple. Refill cups, clear bones, keep your mouth shut. You try not to stare at the nobles in their finery, or the way the steward tastes the wine before serving it, nodding like it's his divine duty. You try not to notice how much food ends up on the floor. You try not to remember the dried beans you've eaten for 3 days straight. Quirky fact of the night. Some noble feasts featured entremets, entertainment between courses. This could be a musical act, a puppet show, or a pie that opened to release live birds. Yes, birds. Imagine cutting into your dinner and having doves fly out. It was all about excess. The more ridiculous, the better. The goal wasn't just to eat. It was to display wealth in edible, absurd form. Now for the scholarly food fight. How often did nobles actually eat like this? Some historians say these feasts were rare, reserved for big events. Others argue that the upper class dined lavishly whenever they could, simply because they could. But everyone agrees that the contrast between the noble table and the peasant bowl was staggering. The divide between salt pork and saffron-roasted capon was more than just culinary. It was a reflection of power, access, and the divine right to have heartburn in luxury. You steal a glance at the lower tables, where the household staff and minor guests sit. Their food is plainer. Still meat, still warm, but no gilded birds. You hope you'll be allowed to eat what's left after the lords have had their fill. Maybe a crust of that weird raisin pie. As the feast continues, the hall gets louder. Wine flows. Stories are told. Someone's playing a lute badly. A dog wanders under the table and steals a ham bone to scattered applause. You're exhausted. Your feet ache. Your sleeves are soaked in something you can't identify. But it's strangely beautiful. The flicker of the firelight on polished goblets, the harmony of clinking dishes and laughter. You're part of something bigger, even if it's only as the person holding the gravy boat. Finally, after what feels like a week, the feast ends. The nobles begin to drift toward the hearths, sipping mead and loosening their belts. You help carry scraps to the back room, bread ends, chicken bones, half-eaten fruits. You're allowed to eat a few as long as you don't touch anything with visible teeth marks. You find a wedge of soft cheese and a heel of white bread and tuck into them like they're holy relics. Then you're sent home. You walk through the dark, the moon high, the night cool and quiet. Your belly is full, your pockets are empty, your tunic is a disaster. But your memory is stuffed with images: golden birds, sweet wine, laughter like thunder. You crawl into bed, still tasting honeyed pork and remembering the glow of firelight on linen and lace. And tonight you sleep like royalty. Filthy, exhausted royalty.